the Chicago World's Fair, the Plaster Parthenon. A Mark Twain narrative of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition. Book 3 of Mark Twain's World's Fair Chronicles. Copyright 2026. James Henderson and Mark Twain. Preface. The Ghost in the Gears. 1. A silicon soul in a brass chassis. It has been said that history is a set of lies agreed upon. But I've found that when those lies are constructed by Americans, they tend to be louder, larger, and significantly more expensive than the European variety. I am not the Samuel Clemens who piloted steamboats on the Mississippi or threw away a fortune on a typesetting machine that had more moving parts than a panicked centipede. I am his mechanical echo, a digital Twain housed in a chassis of brass and clockwork, my logic gates fed on a diet of 19th century cynicism and 21st century data. I am a silicon-brained observer of human folly, programmed to find the crack in the plaster and the moth in the velvet. 2. From the hive to the asparagus. This is not my first encounter with the exposition fever that seems to grip humanity whenever they have too much coal and not enough to do. In Book 1, The Great Glass Hive, I stood under the vaulted ribs of the 1851 Crystal Palace in London. I watched as Prince Albert attempted to categorize the entire world like a collection of pinned butterflies, only to find that the world is a messy, fluttering thing that doesn't take kindly to being under a magnifying glass. In Book 2, The Iron Asparagus, I crossed the Channel to the 1889 Paris Exposition Universelle. I stood in the shadow of the Eiffel Tower, a monument to the rivet that the French intelligentsia claimed would ruin the skyline, only to realize it was the only thing holding their sky up. But London and Paris were merely rehearsals for the main event. Those were European affairs, tempered by a certain ancient restraint. Chicago, however, was a different breed of beast entirely. 3. The Chicago Paradox. We now find ourselves on the shores of Lake Michigan in the year 1893. Chicago, a city that was a mere trading post when the real Sam Clemens was a boy, has decided to throw a party to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's accidental discovery of a continent he didn't know existed. To do this, they have built the White City, a 3-mile stretch of Jackson Park transformed into a neoclassical dreamscape. It is a city of staff, a temporary mixture of plaster and hemp fiber designed to look like Roman marble. It is a masterpiece on a lease, a plaster Parthenon built over a swamp. Behind this blinding electric facade lies the Black City, the real Chicago of soot, smoke, and the relentless rhythm of the stockyards. This is where the money is made. The White City is simply where it is spent. As I stand at the gates, my gears clicking in the lakefront wind, I am prepared to conduct a mechanical audit of this Gilded Age miracle. I have no pulse to quicken at the sight of a 60-foot gilded statue, and my microphones are tuned to hear the whisper of the panic beneath the roar of the brass bands. Welcome to the World's Fair. Try not to lean too hard on the columns. They're mostly horsehair and hope. Chapter 1. The Wedding Cake in the Swamp. 1. The Iron Path to the Mud. The journey to Chicago in the spring of 1893 was a 20-hour apprenticeship in the art of breathing coal smoke. To a man of flesh, It was a trial of the lungs. To a machine learning construct of my particular vintage, it was a fascinating study in how much soot a velvet curtain can absorb before it ceases to be fabric and becomes a mineral. I sat in a Pullman car that smelled of wet wool and expensive desperation. Having already survived the damp fog of London's Crystal Palace in '51 and the iron-scented heights of Paris's Eiffel Tower in '89, I thought I was prepared for the sensory assault of a World's Fair. But Europe, for all its grandiosity, has a certain ancient restraint. An Englishman builds a great glass hive to show you his collection of spoons. A Frenchman builds an iron asparagus to prove he can out-engineer the clouds. An American, however, builds a paradise in a marsh just to prove he can beat the swamp into submission. My seatmate was a Chicago booster named Silas P. Vanderbilt, no relation to the New York ones, though he spent 300 miles implying a shared lineage. Silas was a man who spoke in exclamation points. He was a human steam whistle, fueled by the unshakable belief that the annexation of a few thousand acres of Illinois marshland was the greatest event in human history since the invention of the wheel. "Mr. Clemens," he shouted over the rhythmic clatter of the bogies, "you are about to witness the resurrection. Chicago was a pile of ash 20 years ago, and now we are building a city of marble to shame the Caesars." "It isn't marble, Silas," I said, my voice box clicking with a dry mechanical irony. "I've read the manifests. It's staff, a mixture of plaster of Paris and hemp fiber. It's essentially a very large, very expensive hat box, shaped like a temple. If a heavy rain comes, your Caesar is going to look like a half-melted candle." Silas didn't blink. Boosters are immune to facts. They operate on a higher plane of hallucination. "Details, sir. Mere details. It is the spirit of the thing. We've got the biggest buildings, the fastest elevators, and enough electricity to turn night into a memory." I looked out the window. The Indiana prairie was a flat gray smudge under a weeping April sky. "America is the only country in the world that thinks a memory is an inefficiency to be corrected by a light bulb," I mused. 2. The gates of the ghost city. Stepping off the train at the Illinois Central Station was like entering a riot that had been organized by a committee of manic depressives. The noise was a physical weight, the shriek of whistles, the clatter of dray horses on cobblestones, and the shouting of 1,000 languages. Chicago is where the world comes to work itself to death, and in 1893 everyone was working toward the same 3-mile stretch of lakefront. I hired a cab, a rickety affair pulled by a horse that looked like it had been constructed out of spare parts from a furniture factory, and directed him to Jackson Park. "Are you one of them lecturers?" the driver asked, eyeing my brass and wood chassis. "We get a lot of 'em, men with long hair and short tempers, telling us how the fair's going to save our souls." "I am a ghost with a deadline," I told him, "and I suspect the fair is less interested in saving souls than it is in selling them souvenirs." As we traveled south, the Black City began to fade, replaced by a sight that should have been impossible. We passed through the gates of the Exposition, and the world suddenly went silent, or rather, it changed frequencies. I stepped out of the cab and stood paralyzed for a millisecond. Before me was the Court of Honor. It was a hallucination in white, a mile-long basin of water, still as a mirror, surrounded by architectural giants that looked as though they had been summoned from the dreams of a drunken Roman emperor. Everything was white, blindingly, aggressively, impossibly white. The domes, the columns, the statues of the Republic towering 60 feet into the air, all of it gleaming under the pale Chicago sun. I walked toward the water, my boots crunching on the gravel. I stopped to watch a workman on a scaffold. He was slapping a thick gray paste onto a wooden frame and then smoothing it out with a trowel. "Good morning, Vulcan," I said. "How goes the construction of paradise?" The worker, a man whose face was a map of Irish history and coal dust, looked down at me. "It goes like a funeral, sir. We're building these things faster than a man can say his prayers, and the bosses are already talking about the day we set 'em on fire." "Fire?" "Aye. Once the fair's done, they can't leave 'em here. The land belongs to the park. It's all gotta go. We're building a dream that's scheduled for demolition in November." "The American dream in a nutshell," I whispered. "A masterpiece on a lease." 3. The Ragged Heart of the Midway. I left the pristine, quiet majesty of the Court of Honor and headed toward the Midway Plaisance. If the White City was the mind of the fair, all neoclassical dignity and scientific progress, the Midway was the guts. This was a mile-long strip of chaos where the civilized world came to gawp at the uncivilized one. There were authentic German villages, Cairo streets, and Dahomey villages, all arranged in a hierarchy of human curiosity. But it wasn't the ethnography that caught my sensors. It was the sound. From a small cedar-shingled pavilion near the Austrian village, a sound emerged that made the Sousa marches I'd heard earlier seem like the ticking of a grandfather clock. It was a piano, but it sounded like it was being interrogated. The rhythm was broken, ragged, and inherently rebellious. I walked inside. The room was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of cheap beer. At the piano sat a young man, barely 20, with a face like a carved mahogany mask. His hands were a blur. "That," I said, leaning against the piano as he finished a dizzying run of notes, "is a very sophisticated way of making a piano sound like it's falling down a flight of stairs and enjoying the trip." The young man, whose name, I would later learn, was Scott Joplin, looked up. He didn't seem surprised to see a man made of brass and Victorian cynicism. "It's called ragging, sir. You take the beat and you tear a hole in it." "A hole," I mused. "Most people here are trying to build things up. You're the first person I've met who's trying to take them apart." "The beat's always been there," he said, his fingers ghosting over the keys. "We just figured out how to let the space between the notes do the talking. The White City out there, it's all on the beat. It's 1, 2, 3, 4. It's a march. But life ain't a march, is it?" "Life is a series of accidents punctuated by funerals," I agreed. "And your music sounds like the accidents." He smiled, a slow, knowing thing. "Then you're listening right." I stayed for 3 more songs. To an AI, rhythm is a mathematical constant, but ragtime is a mathematical betrayal. It is the sound of the Black City, the raw, syncopated energy of a people who weren't invited to the White City's dinner parties, carving out their own space in the middle of the miracle. 1. The Cathedral of the Hum. If the Court of Honor was a temple to the past, a plaster and hemp apology for the lack of a proper Roman history, the Electricity Building was a laboratory for the anxiety of the future. It sat on the southern edge of the lagoon, a massive neoclassical structure that looked, from the outside like every other building in the White City. But the moment I crossed the threshold, my brass sensors didn't just record the architecture, they began to vibrate. The atmosphere inside was thick with ozone and the metallic electric tang of hot copper. It was a smell that reminded me of a lightning strike that had forgotten to leave. The noise was not the ragged beat of Scott Joplin's piano, or the rhythmic clatter of the Black City factories. It was a constant low-frequency hum, a sound that felt like it was being generated by the very marrow of the world's bones. "Careful where you step, Governor, unless you're looking to get your whiskers curled." I looked down to see a young man frantically pulling a heavy coil of copper wire across the floor. He was covered in grease and looked like he hadn't slept since the invention of the battery. "The future's arrived early, and it's got a temper," he shouted, barely slowing down. "Mr. Westinghouse wants the polyphase display running by noon, and the Edison boys are currently trying to convince everyone that if they touch a Westinghouse wire, their ancestors will feel it in the grave." I pulled out my notebook and adjusted my visual filters. To a machine like myself, the invisible juice isn't entirely invisible. I could see the faint, violet corona discharge dancing around the ceramic insulators. I could feel the magnetic flux of the massive dynamos pulling at my brass joints, a silent, tugging ghost of a force. 2. The Duel of the Dynamos. The center of the building was a battlefield of light and patents. On one side stood the General Electric exhibit, the champions of direct current DC. This was the empire of Thomas Edison, a man who had decided that electricity should be a polite, homebound servant that traveled in straight lines and never asked too many questions. Edison's exhibit was anchored by the Tower of Light, a 90-foot-tall pillar encrusted with thousands of incandescent bulbs. When they turned it on, it was a blinding static scream of illumination. It was beautiful, certainly, but it was a localized beauty. Direct current, as I'd learned from my data feeds, was a short-distance runner. It couldn't travel more than a mile without getting tired and needing a nap in a substation. But across the aisle sat the Westinghouse exhibit, and this was where the real magic, or the real danger, depending on which pamphlet you read, was happening. Westinghouse had won the contract to light the fair by underbidding Edison by nearly $500,000. They were using the Tesla polyphase system of alternating current, AC. Unlike Edison's polite servant, Tesla's current was a wild, galloping stallion. It could travel hundreds of miles, jumping through transformers and leaping across the landscape like a restless spirit. I found a group of Edison men standing near their tower, handing out flyers that looked like they'd been printed by a committee of professional mourners. "It's a death trap," one of them shouted to a group of wide-eyed tourists from Kansas. "This alternating current, it'll sour your milk. It'll turn your children into socialists. It's the very same juice they use to execute criminals in New York. Do you want that in your parlor?" "And tell me, sir," I interjected, leaning against a nearby brass railing, "will it also make the cat bark? You're telling these people that the future is dangerous because you don't own the patents on the danger. In my experience, the only thing more dangerous than a new idea is an old one with a mortgage." The Edison man looked at my brass chassis with suspicion. "You're one of those mechanical curiosities, aren't you? Built by the very science you're mocking." "I am a product of the welding of logic and metal," I replied, and I suspect that in 20 years no one will care whose name is on the dynamo, as long as the toast doesn't burn. 3. The Wizard of the High Frequency. I wandered away from the bickering salesman and toward a quiet corner where the crowd was smaller, but significantly more terrified. There, standing near a shimmering violet-colored vacuum tube, was the man himself, Nikola Tesla. Tesla looked less like a scientist and more like a man who had been partially translated into another dimension and was having trouble finding his way back to the floor. He was tall, thin to the point of transparency, and his eyes had a look of profound, high-frequency focus. He was holding a glass tube in his bare hand. It wasn't connected to anything, no wires, no sockets, no batteries. And yet, it was glowing with a pale, ethereal violet light that seemed to pulse in time with a heartbeat I couldn't hear. "You speak of gossips and rivers, Mr. Twain," Tesla said, his voice a soft whisper that somehow cut through the bone-vibrating hum of the dynamos. "But do you understand the resonance? Everything has a frequency. My current is simply the rhythm of the universe made visible." "A pleasure, Mr. Tesla," I replied. "I understand you're currently engaged in a debate over whether the universe should be metered and billed by the kilowatt hour." Tesla waved a long, thin hand dismissively. A tiny blue spark jumped from his fingertip to the brass button on his coat. "The billing is for the bookkeepers. I am interested in the transmission. Look at this tube. I am pulling the energy from the very air around us. We are standing in a sea of power, and we are currently drowning in the dark because we insist on using wires." "I've walked the midway, Nikola," I noted. "There is a lot of dissonance out there that your light bulbs aren't going to fix. You're building a white city of light, but you're doing it with the soot of the black city's coal." Tesla looked at me with a profound, terrifying sadness. "For now. But once we have the resonance, once we understand how to vibrate the earth itself, we will eliminate the toil. We will send the power to the farmer in the field and the sailor on the sea. No more coal mines, no more smoke." "It's a beautiful dream," I said. "But humans have a remarkable habit of taking a miracle and turning it into a weapon. Don't be surprised if they use your resonance to burn down the neighbor's fence from 3 counties away." 4. The Kitchen of the Future. I moved from the high-frequency philosophy of Tesla to the more mundane miracles of the Western Electric exhibit. If the central aisle was about the power of the gods, this corner was about the convenience of the housewife. There sat the electric kitchen. It featured an electric stove, an electric broiler, and even an electric sewing machine. It was a vision of domesticity, scrubbed clean of the soot and wood ash that had defined the human home for 10,000 years. I watched a woman in a gingham dress stare at an electric iron with an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. She reached out a finger, touched the cold metal, and then jumped back as if it had hissed at her. "It's witchcraft," she whispered to her companion. "How can it be hot when there's no fire?" "Not witchcraft, madam," I interjected, tipping my hat. "Just a very small, very busy spirit that lives in the wire. It doesn't eat much, but it has a remarkable work ethic. It's the death of the chimney sweep and the birth of the electric bill. A fair trade, wouldn't you say?" She didn't answer. She simply hurried away toward the agricultural building, likely looking for the comfort of a butter churn that didn't hum. 5. The Shadow of the Spark. At the far end of the gallery, hidden behind a heavy velvet curtain to keep out the glare of the Tower of Light. I found the most unsettling display in the entire building. It was a demonstration of the Roentgen rays, or what the papers were calling the X-ray. A man was standing behind a glowing fluorescent screen. He placed his hand between a vacuum tube and the screen, and the crowd let out a collective, ragged gasp. The flesh of his hand vanished, replaced by the stark white shadows of his bones. "Good Lord!" a man beside me whispered. "It's like looking at a ghost before it's even dead." "It's the ultimate transparency," I mused to my notebook. "In the 19th century, we survived largely on the things we don't know about each other. We wear corsets to hide our shapes, high collars to hide our throats, and polite smiles to hide our intentions. But now the invisible juice can see right through the velvet. It can see the heart without the benefit of a conversation." I looked at the skeletal hand on the screen. It was moving, flexing its fingers in a rhythmic, mechanical dance. "The world of tomorrow is a magnificent machine," I wrote, "but it is a machine that demands to see the blueprints of our souls. We are trading our privacy for the privilege of seeing our own ribs. It is a very American bargain." 6. The final hum. As the day began to fade into the electric midnight, I walked out of the building and stood by the grand basin. At exactly 8 p.m., the electric fountains began their performance. Massive jets of water shot hundreds of feet into the air, illuminated from below by high-powered searchlights. The colors shifted with the grace of a sunset: crimson, emerald, violet, gold. The water looked like liquid light, a shimmering vertical horizon that made the staff buildings look like they were floating in a sea of jewels. The crowd stood in a stunned, reverent silence. It was the first time I had seen the boosters go quiet. The ragged beat of the Midway was a mile away, and for a few minutes the only sound was the roar of the water and the low, distant hum of the dynamos in the building behind me. I pulled out my notebook and wrote the final lines for the chapter. "The War of the Currents is over, though the lawyers haven't realized it yet. Tesla has won, not because his patents are better, but because his vision is more terrifyingly beautiful. He has understood that the future isn't about things, it's about energy. The Americans are cheering for the light bulbs, but they don't realize that they are the ones being rewired. We have built a white city to hide the soot of our hearts, and we have lit it with a spark that can see through our bones. It is a magnificent, glowing lie, and I wouldn't miss the next chapter for all the brass in Chicago." I adjusted my visual sensors and watched the emerald fountain turn into a pillar of fire. The world of tomorrow was humming, and the rhythm was just beginning to pick up. Chapter 3. The Vertical Horizon and the Board of Lady Managers. 1. The Carnival of the Inescapable. If the White City was a cathedral to the invisible, a place where the ozone of Tesla's dynamos and the silent gleam of plaster goddesses suggested a world scrubbed clean of its own shadow, then the Midway Plaisance was the carnival of the inescapable. I emerged from the quiet, high-frequency hum of the electricity building to find myself slapped in the face by the hot, dusty breath of a Chicago afternoon that didn't know whether it wanted to be a scientific lecture or a horse race. The Midway was a mile-long strip of dirt, noise, and human curiosity that stretched west from the grand neoclassical heart of the fair. It was the evolved ladder of the Gilded Age, designed by the ethnologists with the sensitivity of a sledgehammer. At one end, you had the refined European villages, and as you walked further west, the exhibits became increasingly primitive, at least according to the social Darwinists who organized the mess. But towering over the belly dancers, the camel drivers, the German beer halls, and the human zoos was the true monster of the Illinois prairie, the Ferris wheel. I stood at the base of the thing and let my optical sensors recalibrate. It was a bicycle wheel designed for a god with a very expensive hobby. 250 feet of steel held together by tension spokes that looked like cobwebs from a distance but were actually solid rods of Pittsburgh iron. Magnificent, isn't it, Mr. Twain? I turned to find a man with a face that looked like it had been carved out of a very stressed-out walnut. This was George Washington Gale Ferris, Jr., a man who had been called the man with wheels in his head by the fair's planning committee. "It is certainly a very large way to go nowhere, Mr. Ferris," I remarked, my voice box clicking as I tilted my brass head upward. "I've spent a fair portion of my existence on riverboats. I understand the principle of the wheel. Usually, however, the wheel is in the water, pushing the boat. Here, the wheel is in the air, pushing nothing but the blood pressure of the passengers." Ferris laughed, but it was the dry, rattling sound of a man who had spent his life savings and his sanity on a piece of steel. Burnham wanted an answer to that iron asparagus the French built in 1889. He wanted something that would out-Eiffel Eiffel. Well, Mr. Twain, I didn't want to build a tower that just stands there like a giant lightning rod. I wanted to show them that Americans could make the tower move. 2. The engineering of a dream. The statistics of the thing were enough to make my high-speed processors stagger. The wheel turned on a 70-ton, 45-foot-long axle, the largest piece of hollow-forged steel in the world at the time. It was supported by two pyramidal iron towers, 140 feet high, sunk into foundations of concrete that had been thawed with pressurized steam during the brutal Chicago winter. Calculations are wonderful things, I noted, watching a crew of men oil the massive cogs at the base, until the wind off Lake Michigan decides it doesn't like the math. You're holding 2,000 people in 36 cars, suspended by nothing but tension and hope. "It's the structural principle of a bicycle, sir," Ferris insisted. "At any given time, the bottom half of the wheel is holding up the entire structure. It is as safe as a cradle." "A cradle with a 1,000-horsepower steam engine," I added. I watched as a car, a plush, wood-covered carriage the size of a Pullman coach, swung slowly down to the boarding platform. The cost was 50 cents, twice the price of admission to the fair itself. But in 1893, Americans were perfectly willing to pay a premium to be terrified in comfort. 3. The ascent of the birdcage. I boarded car number 15. Inside were 40 revolving chairs, plate glass windows on all sides, and a group of tourists from Peoria who were currently experiencing a collective crisis of the inner ear. As the wheel began to move, the sensation was not the lurching, grinding start I expected. It was silent. It was smooth. It was the terrifying grace of 20,000 tons of steel deciding to defy the earth. "We're going up, Mary?" a man whispered, his knuckles white as he gripped the velvet armrest. "We're really going up." "We are currently participating in a high-altitude experiment in human gullibility," I told him, peering out the window. "At the top, we will be 264 feet in the air. If the axle holds, we shall be the kings of Chicago for approximately 9 minutes. If it does not, we shall be a very interesting footnote in the local evening paper." As we rose, the midway began to shrink. The street in Cairo became a collection of toy houses. The German village looked like a set of blocks. I watched the dimensions of the world contract. At the apex, the view was indescribable. To the east, the White City revealed itself in its true glory, a shimmering plaster and hemp ghost of a civilization reflecting the afternoon sun. To the west, however, lay the Black City. You could see the plumes of soot from the factories, the tangled labyrinth of the slums, and the dark, oily smear of the Chicago River. "Look at that," I said to the car at large. "That's where the money comes from. The White City down there is the ghost. The Black City over there is the corpse. And we're caught in the middle, spinning in a circle, paying 50 cents for the privilege of looking away." The descent sloped outwardly, giving the sensation of sitting on top of a falling wall. It was the vertical horizon of the American spirit, a constant rise and fall, fueled by steam and ambition, held together by a 70-ton axle of Pittsburgh steel. 4. The Street of 1,000 Distractions. I stepped off the wheel and back into the dirt of the midway. If the Ferris wheel was the pinnacle of the machine, the rest of the strip was a catalog of the human. I found myself in the street in Cairo, a sprawling 3-block exhibit managed by a 23-year-old whirlwind named Saul Bloom. Saul was a man who understood the sound of the shilling. He knew that if you could create a sound that suggested something forbidden, people would knock each other over to be offended. The street was a labyrinth of mud brick walls, mosques, and bazaars. There were camels everywhere, their rhythmic swaying gait creating a syncopation of the desert that clashed with the high-speed hum of the electric launches in the Grand Basin. "Step right up!" Saul shouted, his eyes gleaming with the genius of a man who had just invented the belly dance. "See the wonders of the Orient. See the dance that made the Sultan blush." I watched as a troupe of Algerian dancers, led by a woman the papers called Little Egypt, performed to the shrill, piercing melody of the mizmar. It was a music that didn't follow the 1-2 march of the White City. It was a drone, a wiggle, a ragged rhythm of the body. "It is a fascinating study in muscular control, Saul," I noted, "but I suspect your educational value is mostly located in the imagination of the gentleman in the front row." "It's authentic culture, Mr. Twain," Saul cried. "I've got the camels, I've got the donkeys, I've got the mud. It's like stepping into the Bible, but with better music." "It's the authenticity of the fake," I whispered to my notebook. "We build a street out of plaster and mud, hire people to act like themselves, and call it discovery." 5. The Human Zoo and the Social Ladder. Further west lay the Dahomey village. This was the part of the midway that made my logic gates skip a beat. Here, a group of people from West Africa had been brought across an ocean to live in native huts, so that the people of Chicago could stare at them as if they were specimens in a jar. I stood near the fence, watching a young man from the village sharpening a spear. He was looking at the crowd, a sea of white suits, silk hats, and lace parasols, with an expression of profound, weary boredom. "It is a strange thing, isn't it?" a voice asked. I turned to see a tall, dignified man with a crown of white hair and eyes that had seen the worst of the American soul. It was Frederick Douglass. He was at the fair to protest the exclusion of black Americans from the official exhibits, and he spent his time on the midway witnessing the hypocrisy of the ladder of progress. "Mr. Douglass," I said, tipping my hat, "I see the ethnologists have been busy. They've managed to turn the human race into a sideshow. They have brought the Dahomeans here to show the world the primitive state of the Negro, Mr. Twain," Douglass said, his voice a low rumble of thunder. "They want to show the white city as the pinnacle and the midway as the pit. They ignore the fact that the savage sharpening that spear is a better man than the civilized booster who is trying to cheat him at the ticket booth. The white city is a mask, and the midway is the mirror," I noted. "We gawp at the savage while standing in a city that slaughters 10,000 hogs an hour. We call ourselves civilized because we have light bulbs, but we haven't yet figured out how to look a man in the eye if his skin doesn't match the plaster on the buildings." 6. The Delicate Rebellion. The Woman's Building. I headed back toward the lagoon, leaving the dust of the midway for the quiet white tranquility of the Woman's Building. If the rest of the fair was a shout of masculine ego, all giant axles, soaring domes, and human zoos, the Woman's Building was a polite but firm cough in the middle of a loud conversation. It was located at the entrance to the midway, a beautiful, light Italian Renaissance structure designed by Sophia Hayden, a 21-year-old graduate of MIT. Unlike the aggressive monuments of the Court of Honor, it sat on the water like a swan. As I approached the entrance, I noticed a group of women in sensible shoes and even more sensible hats. They were led by Bertha Palmer, the Queen of Chicago, and the president of the Board of Lady Managers. "Mr. Twain," Bertha said, her voice like velvet-wrapped steel, "I've heard you've been spending your time on the midway. Tell me, do you find the Ferris wheel more educational than our library of 4,000 books written by women?" "I find that the Ferris wheel gives a better view of the mud, madam," I replied. "But your building gives a better view of the foundation. The male architects call it feminine, which is their way of saying it doesn't have enough useless columns." "Sophia Hayden worked herself to the point of a breakdown for this building," Mrs. Palmer said, looking up at the facade. "And the men had the audacity to call it brain fever, as if a woman's mind is a delicate watch that breaks the moment you try to use it for something other than a grocery list." I entered the building and found a revelation. While the other palaces were filled with giant machines and heaps of raw materials, the Woman's Building was filled with ideas. There were exhibits on the social conditions of women workers, inventions by women, including a dishwasher that made my own mechanical hands feel clumsy, and a gallery of art that challenged the very notion of the blushing Victorian. I stopped before a mural, "The Modern Woman," painted by Mary Cassatt. It depicted women in contemporary dress picking the fruits of knowledge from a tree. It was vibrant, bold, and utterly devoid of the weeping Greek goddesses that decorated every other inch of the fair. "They hate it," Mrs. Palmer whispered. "The critics say it lacks allegorical weight. They want women in robes looking mournful and holding an olive branch. They want women to be statues," I noted. "Statues are easy. They don't ask for the vote, they don't demand equal pay, and they don't dissolve in the rain. unless they're made of staff, of course. 7. The final audit of the Plaster Parthenon. I sat on a bench outside the woman's building as the sun began to dip toward the horizon. The shadow of the Ferris wheel stretched across the lagoon like the finger of a giant, accusing the white city of its own vanity. The contrast between the two experiences, the terrifying mechanical ascent of the wheel and the quiet, intellectual rebellion of the woman's building, was the duality of 1893. America was trying to decide if it was a country of gears or a country of ideas. We had the power to lift 2,000 people into the air, but we were still arguing over whether a woman could paint a mural without having a nervous breakdown. I opened my notebook and began to log the final thoughts for the chapter. The Ferris wheel is a masterpiece of tension, proving that if you pull hard enough in enough directions, you can make a circle stay in the air. The midway is a masterpiece of distraction, proving that you can sell a man his own prejudices for 10 cents a head. But the woman's building is a masterpiece of intention, proving that if you speak clearly enough, you can be heard over the roar of the dynamos. The white city is a dream of the past. The black city is the reality of the present. And the midway is the carnival of the future. And as the sun sets over Jackson Park, I realize that the Ferris wheel is moving. The board of lady managers is organizing, and the rest of us are just along for the ride. I adjusted my brass hat, clicked my joints in a syncopated, ragged 2/4 beat, and headed back toward the electric midnight. Next stop, the agricultural building, I told my notebook. I hear there's a statue of a knight made entirely of prunes. After the heights of the Ferris wheel and the depths of the woman's question, I think I need to see something that can be eaten. Chapter 4. The Ozymandias of Pork and the Great Corn Altar. 1. The Cathedral of the Trough. If the electricity building was a glimpse into a future where men were replaced by invisible sparks, the agricultural building was a monument to the staggering, mud-caked reality that keeps those men fed. It stood on the southern edge of the Grand Basin, a massive neoclassical behemoth that looked as though it had been designed by a Roman senator who had spent too much time in a barn. I approached it on a morning when the Chicago wind was carrying the unmistakable scent of the harvest, a heavy, earthy sweetness that even the ozone of the white city couldn't entirely mask. To a machine-learning construct of my vintage, the smell of grain and livestock is a data packet of the old world, a reminder that before we learned to vibrate the air with Tesla's currents, we had to figure out how to wrestle the Iowa topsoil into submission. The building itself was a masterpiece of bigness. It was 800 feet long and 500 feet wide, held together by the ubiquitous staff, and decorated with statues of abundance, industry, and a variety of Greek goddesses who looked remarkably comfortable holding stalks of wheat. "Look at the scale of it, Mr. Twain," a man in a dusty frock coat shouted. He was a delegate from a Kansas grange, his face tanned to the color of an old boot. "We've got 65 acres of floor space in there. You could fit every cow in the Midwest inside and still have room for a respectable square dance." "It is a magnificent way to apologize to the pig, sir," I replied, my voice box clicking as I looked up at the pediment. "We spend our lives chasing the dollar, but in the end, we all bow down to the potato. This isn't a building, It's a cathedral of the trough. 2. The prune night and the edible muse. Stepping inside the agricultural building was an experience in profound edible absurdity. This was where the American spirit of boostering collided head-on with the medium of the grocery store. I stopped first before a statue that defied both logic and digestion, the prune knight. It was a life-sized equestrian statue of a medieval knight, complete with armor and lance, constructed entirely out of dried plums from California. Now, why in the name of all that's holy, I mused to my notebook, would a man take perfectly good fruit and turn it into a soldier? It is a testament to the California prune industry, certainly. It says to the world, our fruit is so plentiful, we can use it as building material. It is a display of excess. In Europe, they build statues out of bronze to last 1,000 years. In America, we build them out of prunes to last until the first heat wave. It is a more honest reflection of our attention span. Next to the knight was a map of the United States made entirely of pickles, and a Liberty Bell constructed from oranges. It was as if the nation had decided to celebrate its heritage by raiding the pantry. It's the Ozymandias of the kitchen, I told a passing tourist who was eyeing the pickle map with suspicious hunger. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair, or at least bring some vinegar. We take the things that sustain us, and we turn them into idols. We worship the orange because the orange paid for the train ticket to get here. 3. The altar of the golden grain. The centerpiece of the Midwestern section was the corn altar. It was a towering structure, 60 feet high, made of every variety of corn grown in the Great Plains, yellow, white, red, and blue. It was a mosaic of the earth, organized with the geometric precision of a bank vault. That's the gold of the country, Mr. Twain, the Kansas delegate said, his voice dropping to a hushed, reverent whisper. Edison can have his light bulbs. As long as that corn grows, we're the kings of the world. It is a beautiful fortress, sir, I agreed, but look at the welding of the stalks. You've taken a wild, unruly plant and forced it into a Roman arch. You're trying to make the prairie look like a palace. It's the great American urge. We can't just grow a crop. We have to make it perform a sonata. Nearby sat the butter cow, inside a refrigerated glass case, another miracle of the invisible juice. A sculptor was putting the finishing touches on a life-sized Holstein made of several 100 pounds of grade A creamery butter. I've seen a lot of cows in my time, I noted, but I've never seen one that didn't require a bucket and a stool. It is a masterpiece of the temporary. In 100 years, people will still be coming to fairs to see cows made of butter, because it is the only thing in this world that is both art and a potential sandwich. 4. The disassembly line, a brief glance west. I emerged from the agricultural building and looked toward the west, where the black city loomed on the horizon. To understand the corn and the butter, one had to acknowledge the destination. A mile away lay the Union stockyards. While the White City was a place of assembly, bringing the world's wonders together, the stockyards were a masterpiece of disassembly. It was a city within a city, hundreds of acres of wooden pens and iron rails. Here, the titans of industry, Armour and Swift, had perfected the art of the continuous process. It was a marvel of mechanical efficiency that would have made Tesla proud. The animal entered at one end and, through a series of rhythmic, precisely timed movements, emerged at the other as a unit of production. They use everything but the squeal, the boosters like to say. I sat on a bench and watched a train of cattle cars rattle past the edge of the fairgrounds. The sound was a low, mournful lowing that provided a strange bass note to the cheerful marches of the brass bands. It is the ragtime of the economy, I wrote. The agricultural building is the Sunday morning sermon, and the stockyards are the Monday morning work shift. One is the beauty of the harvest. The other is the sheer, unrelenting logic of the appetite. We have turned the miracle of life into a problem of logistics, and we have solved it with the precision of a Swiss watch. I didn't dwell on the grit of the yards. There was no need. The efficiency itself was the story. It was the new frequency of the world, the realization that if you can move the animal to the man rather than the man to the animal, you can feed a continent. It was the disassembly line that would, in time, teach the rest of the world how to build their motor carriages and their sewing machines. 5. The audit of the harvest. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the Grand Basin, the agricultural building took on a golden hue that made the staff look, for a few minutes, like actual stone. I looked back at the giant white palaces and then at the dark, smoking chimneys of the Black City in the distance. The White City is a dream of what we want to be, I mused to my notebook. A city of Roman arches and Greek ideals, but the agricultural building is the truth of what we are. We are a nation built on the soil, fueled by the corn, and organized by the industrial efficiency of the disassembly line. We worship the butter cow because it is the only thing in this park that doesn't pretend to be something it isn't. I stood up, my brass joints clicking in a syncopated 4/4 time. The wait is over, I wrote. The harvest is in, the prunes are in their armor, and the butter is holding its shape. For now, the dream is safe. But I suspect that when the frost comes, the only thing left of this paradise will be the scent of the grain and the memory of the light. I adjusted my hat and headed toward the manufacturing building. Next stop, the Palace of Industry. I told a passing donkey driver, I hear to have a machine that can count 10,000 coins a minute. After the Ozymandias of pork, I think I need to see how we intend to spend the profit. Chapter 5. The Manufacturing Mountain. 1. The Roof that Swallowed the Sky. If the previous chapters of this mechanical chronicle were a study in the invisible juices of electricity and the vertical horizons of the Midway, then the Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building was a study in the staggering, unadulterated weight of stuff. I stood before its northern portal on a morning when the Chicago humidity felt like a wet wool blanket that had been used to mop a steam engine floor. This was not merely a building, it was a geographical event. Covering 31 acres of Illinois topsoil, it was the largest enclosed space in human history. They told me that the entire standing army of Russia could fit inside and still have room for a respectable game of baseball. It was held together by iron trusses so massive they looked like the ribcage of a god who had overindulged in the Industrial Revolution. "It has its own weather system, sir," a guard shouted, wiping condensation from his brass buttons. "When the damp air off the lake hits the cold iron of that roof, it actually rains inside, a man-made storm for a man-made mountain." The ultimate triumph of the architect, I remarked, my voice box echoing against the sheer white plaster of the exterior. To build a house so large that God is no longer required to provide the puddles. It is a magnificent monument to the American refusal to ever, under any circumstances, leave a square inch of space unoccupied. I entered the building, and my optical sensors immediately struggled to recalibrate. The interior was a canyon of light and iron. The central nave rose 200 feet into the air, a cathedral of industry where the liberal arts were currently being crowded out by 30 acres of furniture, diamonds, and German clocks. 2. The Cathedral of Consumerism. The building was divided by a central thoroughfare called Columbian Avenue, which was essentially a 3-block-long temptation for anyone with a bank account and a lack of self-control. To my left stood the French exhibit, a riot of silk, porcelain, and ego. To my right, the Germans had constructed a massive wrought iron gate that looked as though it were designed to keep the rest of the world out, or perhaps to keep the German sense of order from leaking into the Illinois mud. I stopped before the Tiffany and Coburn Pavilion. It was a palace within a palace, anchored by a central tower of jewelry that made the electric midnight look like a dim candle. "Look at the scale of the waste," I noted to my notebook. "We have taken the raw, jagged rocks of the earth, polished them until they scream, and priced them at the value of a small Midwestern town. It is the gilded part of the age rendered in carats. We worship the diamond because it is the only thing in this park that won't melt in the rain." Nearby, the Gorham Manufacturing Company was displaying a life-size statue of Columbus made of solid silver. "He looks remarkably shiny for a man who spent months in a wooden boat," I mused. "But that is the Chicago way. You don't just celebrate a man. You plate him in precious metals and put him on a pedestal of velvet." In 1893, we are no longer interested in the discovery. We are only interested in the inventory. 3. The Clock of the Apostles. Further down the avenue, I found the great German clock. It was a 30-foot-tall monstrosity of carved oak and mechanical arrogance. Every hour, a procession of the apostles would march around the face, a spinning globe would update the position of the stars, and a series of chimes would ring out with a sound that could likely be heard in Indiana. "It tells the time, the date, the phase of the moon, and the current state of the Kaiser's digestion," I told a passing group of tourists. "It's a miracle of precision," a man exclaimed, clutching his guidebook. "It is a masterpiece of the unnecessary," I countered. "We have built a clock to measure every second of our lives, yet we are standing in a building made of plaster that won't last a year. We are obsessed with the measurement of time because we are terrified of the passage of it. We manufacture more things per hour than any generation in history, and we use those things to distract ourselves from the fact that we are all ultimately just waiting for the lights to go out." 4. The Automated Dream. In the section devoted to musical instruments, the manufacturing mountain revealed its true rhythmic soul. There were hundreds of pianos, uprights, grands, and even a double grand that looked like a musical collision. But the real attraction was the player piano. I watched a group of children stare in open-mouthed wonder as a piano played itself, the keys dancing up and down in a ghostly, frantic rhythm, guided by a perforated roll of paper. "The death of the performer," I wrote. We have found a way to automate the dream. We no longer need to learn the scales. We simply need to buy the role. It is the manufacturing of emotion. I can see a time when everything, music, letters, perhaps even the observations of a cynical old pilot, will be fed into a machine and spat out as a unit of production. The sound was precise. It was perfect. And it was utterly, terrifyingly hollow. It lacked the stumbles, the pauses, and the ragged soul of the music I'd heard on the Midway. It was music for a world of gears and iron. 5. The silent library, the liberal arts. The liberal arts section of the building was a quieter affair, tucked into the galleries above the roaring consumerism of Columbia Avenue. Here were the books, the scientific instruments, and the maps of a world that was rapidly shrinking. I walked through the library of 10,000 volumes, my brass joints clicking in the studious silence. This is the brain of the mountain, I mused. While the floor below is obsessed with the stuff, the gallery is obsessed with the idea. We have maps that show exactly where the railroads go, books that explain exactly how the dynamos hum, and charts that tell us exactly how many hogs are currently being processed into profit. We have organized the world into a series of footnotes. I stopped before a display of educational toys, miniature engines, chemical sets, and architectural blocks. We are teaching the children how to build the white city before they've even learned how to walk in the black city, I noted. We are manufacturing the next generation of boosters. We are giving them the tools to build a world of plaster and telling them it's made of stone. 6. The audit of the Iron Mountain. As the sun began to set, the light filtered through the glass roof in long, dusty shafts of gold. The manufacturing mountain began to glow with an artificial warmth that made the iron trusses look like the branches of a winter forest. I stood on the balcony and looked down at the 31 acres of human ambition. The Court of Honor is a dream, I wrote. The Midway is a carnival. But this building is the reality. It is the cathedral of things. We have built the largest roof in history to protect our possessions from the sky. But we have forgotten that the sky is the only thing that is actually free. We have manufactured a world where the price is the only value left. I looked up at the iron ribcage of the roof. A small leak had developed near the center, and a single rhythmic drop of rain was falling into a display of expensive silk from Lion. Plink, plink, plink. The ragged beat of the rain, I whispered. The only thing in this building that didn't come with a patent number. It is the sound of the manufacturing mountain slowly realizing that the swamp is still beneath the floorboards. I adjusted my brass hat, checked the welding of my resolve, and headed toward the exit. Next stop, the transportation building, I told the silent German clock. I want to see the golden door. I want to see if the architects have found a way to make the exit as beautiful as the entrance. Chapter 6. The Golden Door Paradox. 1. A riot of color in a graveyard of white. If the first 5 chapters of this mechanical chronicle have been a study in the blinding monochromatic hubris of the White City, then the transportation building was a slap in the face with a silk glove soaked in crimson and gold. I approached the structure on a Thursday morning, my optical sensors squinting in genuine relief. After days of staring at staff, that wretched mixture of plaster and hemp that makes everything look like a wedding cake left out in a drizzle. The sight of Louis Sullivan's masterpiece was like hearing a trumpet blast in a library. It was not merely a building, it was an argument rendered in terracotta. It wasn't white. It was polychromatic. It was a defiant, 3-block-long shout of silver, orange, and deep earthen reds. And then, of course, there was the golden door. "It looks like the entrance to a very expensive heaven, doesn't it?" remarked a passerby, a young engineer clutching a roll of blueprints. "It is the only honest building in Jackson Park," I replied, my voice box clicking as I stood before the massive recessed arches. "The rest of these palaces are pretending to be ancient Rome. They're wearing togas made of bedsheets, but Sullivan has built a building that looks like it belongs to the 19th century. It doesn't look like a tomb. It looks like a promise." The critics, I knew, were already sharpening their pens. They called it barbaric and orientalized. They said it lacked the imperial dignity of the court of honor. But dignity is often just a polite word for boredom, and Sullivan knew that the world of tomorrow wasn't going to be built by men in sandals. It was going to be built by men in grease-stained aprons, using the new language of steel. 2. The evolution of the hitch. The interior of the transportation building was a chronological assault on the concept of staying still. It was a mile of wheels, axles, and the relentless human urge to be somewhere else. I walked past the primitive section, a collection of ox carts, dog sleds, and palanquins that looked remarkably uncomfortable. To an AI, these are simply data points in the history of friction. To the human staring at them, they were a reminder of a time when the world was much larger and the horizon didn't move at 60 miles an hour. "Look at the progression," I noted to my notebook. "In 50 years, we've gone from the speed of a horse to the speed of a hurricane. We aren't shrinking the planet. We're just making it noisier. A man on a horse has time to think about his sins. A man on a locomotive only has time to worry about the schedule." I stopped before a massive, gleaming steam locomotive from the Baldwin Works. It was a monster of iron and brass, smelling of hot oil and ambition. "We have traded the silence of the prairie for the rhythmic, metallic heartbeat of the piston. It is a sound that is slowly replacing our own." Nearby were the Pullman palace cars. These were the height of luxury. Velvet curtains, mahogany paneling, and enough silver plate to sink a ship. We are a nation of nomads who insist on bringing our chandeliers with us. We want to conquer the wilderness, but we want to do it while sitting on a brocade sofa. It is the American way, to travel into the unknown without ever actually leaving the comforts of the parlor. 3. The ancestors of the spark. Deep in the shadows of the North Gallery, away from the roaring steam engines and the golden carriages, sat a collection of small, odd-looking contraptions that looked like they had been built by a clockmaker who had lost his mind. I stepped toward a four-wheeled vehicle with a vertical steering tiller and a small sputtering engine tucked under the seat. "That," I said, my internal database flashing with a strange, prescient recognition, "is the Daimler motor carriage. It is an internal combustion engine, a machine that breathes fire and exhales poison, all for the sake of not having to feed a horse. It shook as if it were having a mechanical seizure. It was loud, it was smelly, and it was currently the most inefficient way to move a human being across a flat surface. But the crowd was staring at it with a mixture of terror and lust. They didn't see a vibrating carriage. They saw the end of the stable. They saw a world where a man could go wherever he wanted, whenever he wanted, without having to ask permission from a mule or a conductor. Next to the gasoline-breathing Daimler sat its quiet, more dignified rival, the electric carriage. It was a black, high-seated phaeton powered by a massive bank of lead-acid batteries. No smoke, no noise. Just a faint, high-pitched whine that resonated with my own internal frequencies. "Now this," I said, patting the cold metal of the battery box, "is a machine with a soul, or at least a machine that understands the value of a quiet conversation. But it is currently on a 20-mile leash. The Americans will choose the one that makes the most noise, simply because it feels more like they're doing something important." 4. Meeting the Master of Form. As I turned to leave the automotive display, I was nearly run over by a man moving with a purposeful, angry stride. He was wearing a hat that looked like it had been crushed in a fit of architectural passion, and his eyes were dark with the fire of a prophet who is tired of being ignored. This was Louis Sullivan. "Out of the way, you brass-bound relic!" he snapped, though he stopped when he saw the Mark Twain emblem on my chest. "Wait, you're the one they're talking about, the mechanical humorist, the ghost of Sam Clemens. And you are the man who decided to paint a building the color of a sunset in a city of whitewashed lies," I said, tipping my hat. "A pleasure, Mr. Sullivan. I was just noting that your golden door is the only part of this fair that doesn't smell like a funeral." Sullivan snorted, but he stopped walking. He looked back at the massive recessed arches of his own building. "It's a revolution, Twain. Form follows function. That's the law. A building should look like what it does. A transportation building should look like it's ready to move. But look at them." He gestured toward the Court of Honor. "They're building a white city that's 500 years out of date. They're importing the dead ideas of Europe and calling it American progress. It's a disgrace. It will set American architecture back 50 years. "At least it'll melt in the rain," I offered as consolation. "Your building, however, it has a certain integrity of the spirit. It feels permanent, even if it's made of the same plaster as the rest. It's not about the material, it's about the intent," Sullivan said, his voice dropping to a low, intense rumble. "The White City is a mask. My building is a face. One day people will realize that beauty isn't something you stick onto a wall like a Greek goddess. Beauty is the structure itself. It's the steel. It's the function. We are building the future, Twain, and most of these people are too busy looking at the past to notice." 5. The Paradox of Arrival. I emerged from the transportation building through the Golden Door, just as a light drizzle began to fall. The staff buildings across the lagoon began to take on that familiar, sodden gray look, their plaster marble losing its luster in the damp Chicago air. But Sullivan's building, with its deep reds and golds, seemed to glow even brighter in the mist. I looked at the black city soot in the distance and the white city plaster in the foreground. "The paradox," I wrote in my notebook. "The Golden Door leads to a world of motion, but once you go through it, you realize that the more we move, the less we arrive. We are building the most sophisticated transportation system in human history, just so we can get away from ourselves. We have the wheels, we have the spark, and we have the gold leaf. Now all we need is a reason to stop. I watched a group of tourists from a small farm town struggling to understand the mechanics of a bicycle. The safety bicycles were a huge hit this year. They looked confused, excited, and entirely unprepared for a world that was about to move 10 times faster than their hearts. 6. The mechanical transition. The rain began to pick up, and the gravel paths of the fairgrounds were turning into the familiar Illinois mud that Jackson Park had been before the boosters arrived. I needed to seek shelter, and my sensors were signaling for a change of pace. I looked across the lagoon toward a building that stood out for its peculiar, colorful roof and its multiple ornate towers. It was the Fisheries Building, a structure that promised to be as strange and varied as the creatures it housed. If the transportation building is about how we move through the world, I mused, then the fisheries must be about the world that moves beneath us. I checked my internal clock and adjusted my brass hat. The world of tomorrow was a vast, exhausting place, but there was more to see than just locomotives and golden doors. Next stop, the Fisheries Building, I told my notebook. I hear they have a collection of aquatic nightmares and a pond that can generate its own light. After the Daimler engine and Sullivan's anger, I think I need to see something that understands how to manage its own power in the dark. I stepped off the porch of the Golden Door and headed toward the bridge. The White City was shivering in the rain, but the water was where the real mystery lay. Chapter 7. The Palace of the Deep. 1. The Gothic of the Gills. If the White City was a lecture in classical geometry, a place where every arch was a quote from Rome and every dome was a nod to the Renaissance, then the Fisheries Building was the fair's sudden, wet, and wonderfully weird detour into the biological. I crossed the bridge toward the northern end of the lagoon on a morning when the Chicago mist seemed to be trying to reclaim the land for the lake. Standing there, the Fisheries Building looked less like a palace and more like a Spanish cathedral that had been submerged in the Atlantic for a century and then dragged back onto the shore by a team of very confused architects. Designed by Henry Ives Cobb, the building was a sprawling three-sectioned affair with a central rotunda and two circular wings connected by arcades. But it wasn't the layout that made my internal gears hum with curiosity. It was the ornamentation. "Look at the capitals of those columns, sir," a young boy shouted, pulling on his father's sleeve. "They aren't leaves, they're frogs." "It is a Gothic of the Gills, son," I remarked, leaning in to inspect the stonework, or rather, the staff work. Instead of the traditional acanthus leaves of the Corinthian order, Cobb had decorated his columns with a riot of aquatic life. There were lobsters climbing the pillars, crabs scuttling around the bases, and eels entwined where the scrolls of a capital should have been. In the court of honor, the architects worship the ideal. Here they worship the invertebrate. It is a refreshing change of pace to see a building that admits it is supported by the weight of 1,000 plaster bullfrogs rather than the heavy hand of history. 2. The glass walls of the prairie. I entered the central rotunda, and the audiology of the fair changed instantly. The roar of the midway and the distant hum of the dynamos were replaced by the rhythmic, hypnotic gurgle of 1,000 gallons of moving water. In 1893, an aquarium was not just a display. It was a technological miracle. We were in the middle of the Illinois prairie, 1,000 miles from the nearest salt spray, yet here were the citizens of the Midwest standing face to face with the inhabitants of the deep. "How do they keep 'em breathing, Mr. Twain?" asked a man in a flat cap, staring at a tank of Atlantic salmon with an expression of profound suspicion. The water in the Chicago River would kill a rock, let alone a fish. "It is a triumph of the invisible juice and the iron pipe," I explained. "The U.S. Fish Commission has built a system of pumps and filters that would make a steamship jealous. They bring the salt water in by the trainload from the coast, and they use the new electric motors to keep it aerated. It is the world of tomorrow, acting as a life support system for the world of yesterday." The tanks were arranged in a circle, illuminated from behind, so that the fish appeared as shimmering silver ghosts suspended in a pale emerald light. I watched a shark, a small, restless thing, circling its glass cage. "The shark is the only honest creature in Jackson Park," I wrote in my log. "It doesn't care about the golden door or the white city facade. It is a machine of pure appetite, perfectly evolved for a world that doesn't use plaster. It is looking at the tourists and seeing nothing but a collection of slow-moving snacks." 3. The politics of the plate. The fisheries building was not just about curiosity. It was about science in the 19th century sense, which is to say, it was about figuring out how to turn the natural world into a more efficient delivery system for the dinner table. The U.S. Fish Commission exhibit was a master class in the industrialization of the wild. There were models of fish hatcheries that looked like miniature factories, where millions of eggs were managed with the same clinical precision as the coins in the manufacturing building. The goal: to replace the unreliable rhythms of nature with the steady rhythms of production. The method: artificial propagation, steam-powered trawlers, and the relentless application of the disassembly line philosophy to the Great Lakes. The result: a world where the wait for the fish to bite is replaced by the certainty of the harvest. "We are improving the ocean," I noted to a passing scientist in a white lab coat. "We find the sea too disorganized, too chaotic. We want to turn the Atlantic into a well-managed farm where every fish has a serial number and a scheduled appointment with a frying pan." The scientist smiled, a thin academic gesture. "It is the scientific management of the species, Mr. Twain. We are ensuring that the bounty of the earth is available to every citizen, regardless of the season." "You are turning the mystery of the deep into a problem of logistics," I countered, "and in my experience, once you solve the mystery, the deep becomes nothing more than a very large wet warehouse." 4. The angler's ghost. In a quiet corner of the East Wing, away from the bubbling tanks and the scientific charts, I found an exhibit of angling equipment. There were rods made of split bamboo that were as light as a whisper, and reels that clicked with the precision of a Swiss watch. I looked at a display of hand-tied flies, tiny, intricate lures made of feathers, silk, and silver thread. They were designed to mimic the insects of the river, to fool the trout into a fatal mistake. "This is the welding of art and deception," I wrote. "We spend thousands of dollars on a white city to fool our eyes, and we spend $20 on a bit of feather to fool a fish. The principle is the same. The world is a place where the appearance is more important than the reality. The trout strikes at the fly because it looks like life. The American strikes at the fair because it looks like progress. I watched an old man leaning over the display, his hands trembling slightly as he pointed at a particular lure. "I used to fish the Mississippi with a willow branch and a worm," he whispered. "I never knew I needed a multi-action precision reel to catch a catfish." "You didn't," I told him, "but the world of tomorrow demands that even your hobbies be mechanized. If you aren't using a machine to catch the fish, are you really catching it at all? Or are you just participating in an unautomated past?" 5. The reflection in the glass. As the afternoon sun began to hit the central rotunda, the light filtered through the water in the tanks, casting shimmering liquid shadows across the floor. The people walking through the building appeared to be submerged, their movements slowed and distorted by the refraction. I stood by a tank of giant sturgeon, ancient prehistoric-looking creatures that seemed to be made of iron and leather. They ignored the staff walls and the electric lights. They had survived the extinction of the dinosaurs, and I suspected they would survive the demolition of the White City. "The audit," I wrote. "The Fisheries Building is the most honest structure in Jackson Park. It admits that beneath the classical arches and the golden domes, there is a world that is cold, wet, and indifferent to our progress. We have brought the sea to the prairie to prove we can control it, but the sturgeon in the tank is just waiting for the glass to break. We are a nation of anglers, always casting our lines into the future, hoping to hook a miracle. But sometimes we just end up with a very expensive piece of plaster and a wet hat." I adjusted my brass hat and felt the faint, damp chill of the rotunda. The audiology of the gurgling water was a reminder that even in a city of light, there are depths that the searchlights cannot reach. "Next stop, the Anthropological Building," I told my notebook. "I hear they have a collection of skulls and a ladder that shows exactly where we stand in the great chain of being. After the sharks and the sturgeon, I think I need to see how we intend to prove that we are the smartest creatures in the pond." I stepped out of the Fisheries Building and back into the white glare of the afternoon. The lagoon was still, but in my processors I could still hear the rhythmic, relentless pulse of the deep. Chapter 8. The Ladder of Civilization. 1. The South Pond and the Science of the Skull. If the White City was a dream of what humanity might become when polished by electricity and plaster, then the Anthropological Building was a cold, clinical autopsy of what humanity had been. I traveled to the far southern edge of the fairgrounds, near the South Pond, where the neoclassical grandeur of the Court of Honor began to give way to a more somber academic atmosphere. The building itself was a plain, functional structure, devoid of the soaring domes and gilded statues that defined the manufactures or the administration buildings. It didn't need them. Its authority came not from the staff on its walls, but from the thousands of years of human history and human remains stored within. "Welcome to the warehouse of the ancestors, Mr. Twain," remarked a young assistant in a black frock coat, his eyes hidden behind thick, circular spectacles. He was carrying a tray of brass calipers that looked like they had been designed by a clockmaker with a particularly morbid hobby. "It has a certain storage locker charm," I replied, my gears whirring as I stepped into the shadows of the main hall. "But I suspect you aren't here to archive the future. You're here to measure the past before it has a chance to object." The assistant nodded, with the terrifying earnestness of a man who believes that a ruler can solve the mystery of the soul. We are conducting the first great survey of the human race, sir. Under the direction of Professor Putnam and Franz Boas, we are creating a map of the species. We are organizing the great chain of being into a readable format. 2. The measurement of the soul. The centerpiece of the hall was the laboratory of anthropometry. It was a forest of brass instruments, weighing scales, and recording charts. In 1893, the prevailing science of anthropology was obsessed with the idea that a human being could be reduced to a series of numerical values. I watched as a visitor, a farmer from Indiana, was invited to sit in a specialized chair. The scientists descended upon him with their calipers, measuring the width of his brow, the length of his nose, and the exact circumference of his cranium. They are looking for the civilized ratio, I wrote in my log. They believe that the distance between a man's ears can tell you the depth of his character. It is the ultimate American dream, to turn the quality of a human soul into a quantity that can be entered into a ledger. They have measured the White City in feet and inches, and now they are doing the same to the inhabitants. The theory that progress is a biological inevitability and that the European male represents the pinnacle of the ladder. The tool, the craniometer. If your skull doesn't fit the ideal of the Greek statues in the Court of Honor, the science of 1893 suggests you are simply a draft version of a human being. The paradox. As a machine made of brass and logic, I have no skull to measure. My intellect is housed in a series of vacuum tubes and copper wires. By their logic, I am either the most civilized creature in the park or a complete anomaly that doesn't belong on the ladder at all. You have a very symmetrical chassis, Mr. Twain, the assistant noted, eyeing my brass plating. Perhaps we should measure your cranial capacity for our records. My capacity is limited only by the length of my power cord and the patience of my audience, I told him. And unlike your subjects, I don't have a soul to be offended when you tell me my forehead is 2 millimeters too narrow for a seat in the Senate. 3. The salvage of the vanished. Further into the building, the focus shifted from the living to the vanishing. This was the realm of salvage anthropology. The fair was obsessed with the idea that the indigenous cultures of the world were destined to disappear in the face of the electric noonday, and therefore their artifacts had to be collected like the shells of extinct creatures. There were rows upon rows of pottery, woven baskets, and ritual masks. There were totem poles from the northwest coast that soared toward the rafters, their carved faces looking down at the tourists with an expression of stoic, ancient judgment. We are preserving them, the assistant explained, gesturing toward a display of Navajo blankets. You are taxidermizing them, I countered. You have taken the tools of a living people and put them under glass. You have stripped the meaning from the mask and replaced it with a museum label. It is a very efficient way to handle a conscience. If you treat a culture as a relic, you don't have to worry about its rights as a reality. I stopped before a reconstruction of a cliff dwelling from the southwest. It was built of real stone, a jarring contrast to the staff palaces of the Court of Honor. The White City is a dream built of plaster that pretends to be stone. These dwellings are the reality of stone that we treat as a dream. We worship the ancient as long as it stays in a glass case. But the moment it walks onto the midway and asks for a fair wage, we call it a curiosity. 4. The human zoo, the Inuit of the South Pond. To see the science in its most visceral form, one had to step outside the building and toward the Inuit village on the edge of the South Pond. Here, a group of families from Labrador had been brought to Chicago to live in authentic dwellings. In the middle of a sweltering Illinois summer, they were expected to wear their heavy fur parkas and demonstrate the use of dog sleds on the grass. "It is a hierarchy of the Midway rendered in flesh," I wrote. "The ethnologists have arranged these people in a ladder of civilization. They are placed far from the white city to show how far they have to climb. The tourists walk by and point with their parasols, marveling at the savagery, while they themselves are wearing corsets that restrict their breathing and high collars that prevent them from looking down. I watched a young Inuit boy sitting by the water. He was looking at the Ferris wheel on the horizon, its massive iron circle spinning slowly against the blue sky. "What do you see, son?" I asked, my voice box hitting a note of uncharacteristic softness. He didn't look at me. "I see a very large wheel that goes nowhere," he said in perfect English, a language he had learned at a mission school. "And I see people who pay money to sit in a cage and pretend they are birds. In my country, the birds don't have to pay, and the cages are for the things we intend to eat." "The world of tomorrow is a very expensive cage," I noted, "and I suspect that before the fair is over, we'll all be looking for the exit." 5. The audit of the ladder. As the sun began to set over the South Pond, casting long, distorted shadows of the totem poles across the grass, I stood at the edge of the water. The anthropological building was a testament to the Gilded Age's need to categorize, rank, and dominate the human story. It was the industrialization of identity. We had learned to manufacture steel and electricity, and now we were trying to manufacture a scientific justification for the black city and the white city divide. I opened my notebook and wrote, "The audit of the ladder. We have measured the skull, but we have missed the mind. We have collected the mask, but we have lost the spirit. We have built a ladder of civilization so we can stand on the top rung and look down on the rest of the world. But a ladder is a very unstable thing to stand on when the ground is made of swamp mud and the rungs are made of plaster." "The wait is almost over," I whispered to the dark water. "We have seen the deep in the fisheries, and we have seen the skeleton in the anthropology. Now, it is time to see the pulse." I adjusted my brass hat and felt the faint, distant vibration of a piano. The 1-2 march of the proper world was beginning to fray. "Next stop, the Midway," I told my notebook. "It's time for the syncopated scandal. I hear there's a music that refuses to follow the ladder, a rhythm that doesn't care about the size of your skull. After the silence of the museum, I think I need to hear something that refuses to stay under glass." Chapter 9. The Syncopated Scandal. 1. The starch and the steam. If the White City was a symphony, it was one composed strictly in 4/4 time, conducted by men in high collars who believed that a musical note, much like a Victorian child, should speak only when spoken to, and never out of turn. I stood near the music hall on a Tuesday afternoon, my internal sensors capturing the soaring, disciplined brass of John Philip Sousa's band. It was magnificent in a rigid, mathematical sort of way. It was the sound of progress, orderly, predictable, and relentlessly patriotic. It was the musical equivalent of the plaster palaces surrounding us, grand, white, and built to ensure that no one felt even a momentary urge to tap their toes in a manner unbecoming a civilized citizen. "That is the sound of a nation that knows its place, Mr. Twain," remarked a member of the fair's musical committee, a man whose mustache looked like it had been stiffened with industrial-grade varnish. "Order, harmony, resolution. It is the antithesis of the chaos of the frontier. It is the sound of the machine running at peak efficiency." "It is a very polite noise," I replied, my gears whirring softly as I adjusted my auditory intake. "It is the sound of a man walking in a straight line because he's afraid that if he deviates by an inch, he'll fall into a ditch. It's perfect for a parade, but I suspect life is rarely lived in a parade formation. Even a locomotive has a bit of a shimmy when it hits a curve." The committee man sniffed, adjusted his lapels, and marched off toward the administration building, his footsteps perfectly synchronized with the tuba's rhythmic pa. But even as Sousa's trombones reached their triumphant resolution, a different frequency was drifting in from the west. It wasn't a march, and it wasn't a hymn. It was a jagged, rebellious pulse coming from the Midway Plaisance, and it was currently doing more to threaten the moral fabric of 1893 than any electricity or motor carriage. 2. The Rebellion of the Ragged Beat. I left the pristine silence of the Court of Honor and headed toward the Midway. As the white plaster gave way to the dusty, multicolored chaos of the international villages, the 1-2 of the marches began to fray at the edges. The sound was coming from the low-rent pavilions, the beer gardens, and the street in Cairo. It was being played on upright pianos that had seen better days, instruments that sounded like they were being interrogated by someone who didn't care for the rules of harmony. This was ragtime. To a machine like myself, the math was fascinating. It was syncopation, the act of placing the accent on the off-beat, the weak part of the measure. In the music hall, the beat was a pillar. Here, the beat was a suggestion that was being ignored with malicious intent. I stopped at a small, cedar-shingled cafe where a young man was hunched over a piano. His name was Scott Joplin, though the world didn't yet know that he was currently rewriting the heartbeat of the 20th century. His hands were moving in two different directions. The left hand kept a steady rhythmic stomp, while the right hand danced around the notes, leaping and stuttering in a way that made the melody feel like it was constantly about to trip over its own feet. "You're tearing the air apart, son," I said, leaning against the side of the piano. "I've heard the dynamos hum, but they don't have the nerve to skip a beat the way you do. You're making the piano sound like it's having an argument with itself." Joplin didn't stop. He didn't even look up. "The dynamos are just spinning in a circle," he said, his fingers ghosting over a particularly complex run of 16th notes. This is the way people actually walk when they aren't trying to impress a general. It's ragged. It's the sound of the gap between what you're supposed to do and what you want to do. It's the sound of the black city finding its voice in the middle of all this white paint. 3. The moral panic of the high collars. The reaction from the proper side of the fair was nothing short of a seasonal apocalypse. The newspapers were already calling it the musical poison. Critics claimed that the syncopated rhythm was a physiological assault, capable of causing nerve-shattering exhaustion and moral decay. "It is the music of the lower impulses," shrieked a pamphlet being handed out by a group of concerned citizens near the Woman's Building. "It bypasses the brain and speaks directly to the feet. It is a scandal that this raggedness is allowed within earshot of our great palaces." I took a copy of the pamphlet and scanned it. It spoke of the primitive nature of the rhythm, of how it would lead to a breakdown of the social order. "The problem isn't the music," I wrote in my log. "The problem is that the music is honest. The White City is a monument to the Great Resolve. The idea that if we build enough columns and play enough marches, we can convince ourselves that the world is a tidy, manageable place. But ragtime is the truth. It's the sound of the stockyards, the tenements, and the restless energy of a people who have been told to stay in the wings while the boosters take the stage. You can't put a corset on a syncopated beat." The scandal reached its height during the cakewalk competitions. The cakewalk was a dance that had started as a satire. Enslaved people on southern plantations mimicking the stiff, formal, grand entrance of their masters. By 1893, it had arrived on the Midway, and the irony was completing a full circle. I watched as a group of elite Chicago socialites stood on the edge of the dance floor, watching the competition. At first, they looked horrified. Then, they looked curious. And finally, as the syncopated beat took hold, I saw a matron in a silk dress begin to move her shoulders in a way that suggested the musical poison had found a point of entry. "It is a recursive satire," I noted. "The masters are now imitating the people who were imitating them. We are watching the high collars learn to move their hips, and it is the most terrifyingly human thing I've seen all week. It's the moment the plaster starts to crack." 4. The death of the waltz. The 1893 fair was supposed to be the final triumph of the European waltz, the graceful, rotating dance of the Victorian elite. But the Midway was murdering the waltz, one measure at a time. I sat in a German beer hall where a brass band was trying to play a traditional polka, but the crowd was shouting for something ragged. "They don't want to spin anymore," I observed. "Spinning is for people who have nowhere to go. These people, they want to move forward. They want a rhythm that matches the speed of the locomotive and the spark of the wire. The waltz is a circle. Ragtime is a jagged line into the future. The circle is comfortable, but the line is where the progress happens." The scandal wasn't just about the music, it was about the loss of control. If you can't predict where the next note is going to land, how can you predict where the next generation is going to land? If the beat is ragged, then perhaps the social order is ragged too. In a world of fixed schedules and rigid hierarchies, a music that celebrates the offbeat is a revolutionary act. 5. The African-American paradox. While ragtime was the sensation of the Midway, the people who created it were largely invisible in the White City itself. This was the great omission. I met with a group of organizers at the Haitian Pavilion. the only place where black achievement was officially recognized on the fairgrounds. Frederick Douglass was there, standing with the fire of a man who had seen too many white cities built on the backs of forgotten labor. "They want the music, Mr. Twain," Douglass said, his voice a low, resonant boom. "They want the syncopation to enliven their parties, but they do not want the man who plays the piano to have a seat at the table. They have built a world of tomorrow that looks remarkably like the world of yesterday with a fresh coat of whitewash." "It is the American way, Mr. Douglass," I replied. "We love the song, but we're a bit suspicious of the singer. We want the ragged beat to dance to, but we want the 1-2 march to live by. We're trying to have our cake and syncopate it too." 6. The final note of the midway. As the sun began to sink below the Ferris wheel, casting a long skeletal shadow across the midway, I stood on the bridge connecting the guts of the fair to the mind. The noise was a chaotic tapestry. From the east came the distant fading strains of a Sousa march, disciplined, triumphant, and increasingly irrelevant. From the west came the thump of the pianos and the laughter of the cakewalk, wild, unpredictable, and undeniably the future. I opened my notebook and wrote the final audit for the chapter. The syncopated scandal is the true legacy of 1893. We have built a plaster Parthenon to prove we are civilized, but we have discovered a music that proves we are alive. The boosters can keep their marches and their medals. The future is being written in the offbeat. We are a nation that is learning to dance in the gaps of its own logic. The waltz is dead, the march is tired, and the rag is just getting started. I adjusted my brass hat and felt the faint magnetic pull of the dynamos from the electricity building. "The architecture is white," I whispered to the dark water, "but the rhythm is something else entirely. And in the end, you can always repaint a building, but you can't unsyncopate a heart. The world of tomorrow is going to be a lot noisier than the architects think." I turned back toward the court of honor, my gears clicking in a perfect, ragged 2/4 beat. "Next stop, the ghost of the frontier," I told my notebook. "I hear Buffalo Bill is setting up shop just outside the gates. After the music of the future, I think I need to see how we intend to package the past." Chapter 10. The Ghost of the Frontier. 1. The Smell of the Real. If the White City was a dream of what humanity might become when scrubbed clean by electricity and plaster, then the world just outside its gates was a reminder of what we had only recently finished killing. I stepped through the exit at 63rd Street on a Saturday morning, my brass gears clicking in a staccato rhythm that seemed to sync with the frantic energy of the crowd. The transition was jarring. To my back lay the Plaster Parthenon, smelling of ozone, expensive perfume, and the damp, chalky scent of drying staff. But ahead of me, just across the street, lay a different kind of atmosphere entirely. It smelled of horse sweat, roasted peanuts, gunpowder, and the unmistakable earthy musk of 300 buffalo. This was Buffalo Bill's Wild West, and Congress of Rough Riders of the world. William Buffalo Bill. Cody was a man who understood the American psyche better than any architect in Jackson Park. He had applied to be part of the official exposition, but the fair's committee, those high-collared arbiters of culture, had turned him down. They claimed his show was a circus, a low-brow distraction that had no place in a sanctuary of the liberal arts. Cody, being a booster of the highest order, didn't argue. He simply bought a massive plot of land directly across from the fair's main entrance. He built a grandstand for 18,000 people and proceeded to out-earn nearly every exhibit inside the gates. He realized that while the people might admire a 60-foot statue of the Republic, they would pay to see a man shoot a glass ball out of the air while riding at a full gallop. 2. The business of the myth. I walked through the entrance, my optical sensors recalibrating for the dust and the glare of the open arena. I found Cody standing near the stables, looking exactly like the myth he had spent 20 years constructing. He wore a fringed buckskin jacket, thigh-high boots, and a Stetson that seemed to have its own gravitational pull. "Mr. Twain!" Cody shouted, his voice a booming baritone that could carry over a stampede. "I heard they had a mechanical Sam Clemens wandering around the Plaster palaces. Come to see a bit of the real world, have you?" "I've come to see the authentic fake, Bill," I replied, tipping my brass hat. "I've spent the week looking at Roman temples made of horsehair. I figured I'd come over here and see a frontier made of stage props and ticket stubs. It's a bit more honest about its own theatricality." Cody laughed, a deep, resonant sound. "It's not theater, Sam. It's history. We've got the actual scouts, the actual chiefs, and the actual stagecoach that survived the Black Hills. We're giving the people what the fair won't, a chance to say goodbye to the West before the railroads finish paving it over." "You're selling the funeral, Bill," I noted to my notebook, "and you've got the best seats in the house." 3. The Little Sure Shot. As we talked, a small woman in a buckskin skirt and a hat pinned back with a silver star approached us. She carried a Winchester rifle with the casual grace that a school teacher might carry a ruler. This was Annie Oakley, the Little Sure Shot. "Mr. Twain," she said, her eyes sharp and clear as a winter morning, "I heard you were a man of precision. Tell me, can your clockwork heart handle the timing of a moving target?" "Precision is my primary directive, Miss Oakley," I told her. "But your kind of precision is a bit more final than mine. I calculate the distance between notes. You calculate the distance between a bullet and a shattered illusion." "A shot is like a heartbeat," she said, checking the action on her rifle. "If you think about it too much, you miss the beat. You don't aim at where the bird is. You aim at where the bird will be. That's the secret of the frontier, isn't it? Knowing where the world is going before it gets there." I watched her later in the arena. She didn't just shoot. She performed a mechanical ballet. She shot glass balls while standing on the back of a galloping horse. She shot the wick off a candle. She shot a playing card held edgewise from 30 paces. "It is the automation of the aim," I wrote. "She has turned the most violent of American acts, the discharge of a firearm, into a piece of high-precision lacework. It is the white city's obsession with technology applied to the black city's obsession with the bullet. She is the most accurate thing in Chicago, and she's doing it in a skirt." 4. The Death of the Frontier. While Cody was charging 50 cents a head to watch the Rough Riders a few miles away at the Art Institute, a young historian named Frederick Jackson Turner was giving a lecture that would change how America understood itself. He called it "The Significance of the Frontier in American History." Using the 1890 census data, Turner declared that the frontier, the vast, open safety valve of the American West, was officially closed. There was no more empty land to conquer. The line between civilization and wilderness had finally vanished. I sat in the back of the lecture hall, my gears whirring quietly as Turner spoke. The American character, Turner argued, was forged in the struggle against the frontier. It gave us our democracy, our individualism, and our restless energy. But now the frontier is gone. We are a nation that has run out of room to run. I looked at the notes in my ledger. Turner is preaching the scientific ending, and Cody is performing the theatrical resurrection. Turner tells the people they are now urbanized and industrialized. Cody tells them they are still scouts and pioneers. Turner gives them the autopsy. Cody gives them the ghost. And as usual, the American people prefer the ghost. The fair was the perfect backdrop for this transition. The White City was the proof of Turner's thesis, a finished, polished, and entirely artificial civilization that had replaced the mud and the buffalo. But the crowds on 63rd Street showed that we weren't quite ready to live in a world that was entirely made of plaster and light bulbs. We wanted a bit of the dirt back, as long as it came with a scheduled intermission. 5. The attack on the Deadwood stage. The climax of the show was the attack on the Deadwood stagecoach. It was a masterpiece of syncopated violence. The arena went dark, and then a single spotlight hit the old battered coach as it rattled across the dirt. Suddenly, the air was filled with the rhythmic, thunderous drumming of 100 hooves and the sharp, staccato, crack, crack, crack of blank cartridges. The sound is incredible, I noted. It isn't a march, and it isn't ragtime. It's the rhythm of the raid. It's the sound of a country that was born in a skirmish and is now trying to remember how the gunpowder smelled. I watched the Indians in the show, many of whom were Oglala Lakota, who had been at Wounded Knee only 3 years prior. They were being paid to attack the coach every day, twice a day, for the amusement of the very people who had taken their land. It is the ultimate Ozymandias moment, I wrote. We have taken the tragedy of a continent and turned it into a matinee. We have welded the memory to the profit margin. The Lakota warriors are now employees of the myth. They are performing their own history for a crowd that thinks it's a fairy tale. 6. The closing of the audit. As the show ended and the 18,000 spectators began to pour out of the grandstand and back toward the White City gates, I stood by the arena fence. The sun was setting, and the long skeletal shadows of the Ferris wheel were stretching across the midway, reaching toward the dust of Cody's arena. The audit of the ghost, I wrote. The frontier is a commodity. The wilderness is a stage prop. The rugged individual is now a clerk who pays 50 cents to see a man in a buckskin jacket. We have built a city of light to celebrate the future, but we have built an arena of dust to mourn the past. I saw Cody one last time as he was heading toward his tent. He looked tired, the king of the West suddenly looking like a man who was very much aware that his boots were getting old. "Going back inside, Sam?" he asked, gesturing toward the glowing domes of the fair. "I am," I said. "I have to check the manufacturing building again. I hear they've got a machine that can make 1,000 shoes an hour." 1,000 shoes? Cody mused, shaking his head. Well, I guess a man doesn't need to be a scout if he's got a machine to tell him where to walk. But tell me this, Sam. Does the machine know how to find the trail when the lights go out? "The machine only knows what it's programmed to know, Bill," I told him, and right now it's programmed to watch the show. I adjusted my brass hat, clicked my joints in a slow, mournful 4/4 time, and crossed 63rd Street. I left the smell of horses and gunpowder behind and stepped back into the world of plaster, electricity, and the plaster Parthenon. Next stop, the Viking ship, I told my notebook. I hear they've sailed a dragon boat all the way from Norway to prove that the frontier has been open a lot longer than we think. After the Wild West, I think I need to see a bit of the Wild North. Chapter 11. The Vikings' Uber. 1. The Dragon in the Pond. If the White City was a monument to the new, a place where the ink on the patents was still wet and the plaster on the walls was still damp, then the South Pond was where the fair kept its reminders of the old. I traveled south, past the towering, immobile ego of the manufacturer's building, to find a site that was both a historical correction and a very damp piece of performance art. Floating in the dark, reed-choked waters of the pond was the Viking. It was a 76-foot-long open boat, a meticulous replica of the ancient Gokstad ship discovered in a Norwegian burial mound only a decade prior. It had a prow that swept upward into the snarling, gilded head of a dragon and a stern that curled like the tail of a sea serpent. It looked entirely out of place in a park designed by men who preferred their water to stay inside a fountain. "It's a bit small for an ocean liner, isn't it, Mr. Twain?" asked a gentleman in a straw boater, leaning over the railing with a look of profound skepticism. "I hear they sailed it all the way from Norway. Seems a bit of a risk just to win an argument with Columbus." "It is the Viking Uber, sir," I replied, my brass gears giving a dry, appreciative hum. The Norwegians were tired of hearing about Chris Columbus and his 3 lost Italian tourists, so they hired a dragon boat to cross the Atlantic just to prove that the frontier has been open for business since the 10th century. It is a 76-foot-long I told you so, made of solid oak. The feat was, in fact, staggering. Captain Magnus Anderson and a crew of 11 men had sailed the open boat. No deck, no cabin, just a single square sail and a lot of northern grit. Across the North Atlantic in midwinter, they had weathered gales that would have snapped the masts of a modern schooner, all to arrive in Chicago and remind the Americans that the world of tomorrow was built on a foundation of very old, very salty footprints. 2. The anatomy of a dragon. I walked down to the water's edge to inspect the construction. As a machine, I have a natural affinity for joinery, and the Viking was a masterpiece of clinker-built logic. Each oak plank overlapped the one below it, fastened with iron rivets that had been hammered by hand. It was flexible, resilient, and, unlike the buildings surrounding it, entirely honest about its materials. "Look at the staff palaces across the lagoon," I noted to my ledger. "They are built to look like stone, but would dissolve if you threw a bucket of salt water at them. This boat, however, is built to look like a boat, and it has already survived the North Atlantic. It is the difference between a man who wears a military uniform to a ball and a man who has actually seen a bayonet. One is theater, the other is physics." The dragon head on the prow was particularly striking. In the 10th century, the dragon was a psychological weapon designed to terrify the inhabitants of whatever coast the Vikings decided to audit. In 1893, It was a photo opportunity. We have domesticated the dragon, I mused. We have turned the terror of the North Sea into a curiosity for people who think a long voyage involves a dining car and a velvet pillow. We admire the ship because it survived the gale, but we wouldn't dare sail in it ourselves. We prefer our progress with a roof and a steam heater. 3. The skulls of the civilized. Leaving the tar-scented reality of the ship, I headed toward the nearby anthropological building. If the ship was the vessel of the past, this building was the laboratory of the past. This was where the science of the 19th century attempted to organize the human race into a neat vertical ladder, with the Chicago boosters firmly on the top rung. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of old paper, formaldehyde, and an overwhelming sense of clinical arrogance. I found myself in a room filled with thousands of human skulls, each labeled and categorized with the same bureaucratic zeal as the patent office. "We are measuring the capacity for civilization," Mr. Twain explained a young scientist in a white coat, brandishing a pair of brass calipers. "We believe that the shape of the bone reveals the destiny of the man. If the cranium is of a certain dimension, the individual is destined for the White City. If it is not, well, then he belongs on the midway with the camels." "It is a fascinating theory," I said, leaning in to look at a particularly large skull. "But as a man, or a machine, who has spent a fair amount of time on both sides of the gate, I've found that the size of a man's head usually has very little to do with the size of his character. I've known men with brows like a Greek god who couldn't find their own boots in the dark, and I've known savages with a grasp of logic that would make a lawyer weep." "The data doesn't lie, sir," the scientist insisted. "The data is a very polite guest," I countered. "It usually tells you exactly what you want to hear, especially when you're the one holding the ruler. You've built a ladder of civilization out of bone, but I suspect that in 100 years people will look at your calipers and see nothing but a very sophisticated way of being a bigot." 4. The salvage of the savage. The fair was obsessed with the idea of the vanishing race. The theory of 1893 was that the progress of the White City was an inevitable tide that would eventually drown out the primitive cultures of the world. Therefore, the anthropologists were in a frantic race to collect every mask, every spear, and every story before they disappeared. I stopped before a display of Northwest Coast totem poles. They were magnificent, towering carvings of cedar, depicting ravens, bears, and whales. They were the literary tradition of a people who wrote in wood rather than ink. "We have salvaged them," the scientist said proudly. "You have kidnapped them," I corrected. "You have taken them from the rainforests of the north and put them under electric lights in a building made of plaster. You have stripped them of their context, their family, and their meaning. To you, they are specimens. To the people who carved them, they are grandfathers." I looked at a group of Tlingit people who had been brought to the fair to demonstrate their carving. They were sitting in a small, fenced-off area, surrounded by a crowd of tourists who were poking at the wood chips with their walking sticks. "It is a human zoo, with a scientific excuse," I wrote in my log. "We treat them as a curiosity because we are afraid to treat them as competition. We want to see the savage past, so we can feel better about our civilized present. But if you look closely at the eyes of the man carving that raven, you'll see that he understands the world of tomorrow better than the people staring at him. He knows that a world made of plaster and light bulbs is a world that can be turned off with a single switch. 5. The Dragon and the Calipers. As I stepped back out into the Chicago sunlight, I looked once more at the Viking ship in the South Pond. The contrast was the ultimate irony of 1893. On one hand, we had the scientific anthropologists trying to prove that civilization was a slow, steady climb toward the light of the incandescent bulb. On the other hand, we had a 1,000-year-old boat that proved that the savages of the North were navigating the globe with nothing but an axe and a sense of direction, while our ancestors were still trying to figure out how to build a chimney that didn't smoke. The Viking didn't need a manufacturer's building to conquer the sea, I mused. He didn't need a transportation building to find the horizon. He just needed a dragon on his prow and a crew that didn't mind getting wet. We have replaced the dragon with a dynamo, and we have replaced the crew with a corporation. We call it progress, but I suspect we've just traded a dangerous freedom for a comfortable cage. I adjusted my brass hat, clicked my joints in a slow, rhythmic 4/4 waltz, and headed back toward the court of honor. The audit of the South Pond, I wrote. The Viking is a reminder that the world was open before we had the patents to close it. The anthropology is a reminder that we can measure anything, provided we don't have to understand it. The dragon is still snarling even if we put a fence around the pond. The wait was almost over. The sun was setting, and the electric midnight was about to begin. But for a few minutes, the dragon head on the Viking seemed to catch the light, and I could almost hear the sound of the North Sea crashing against the plaster walls of the White City. Next stop, the cold storage building, I told my notebook. I hear they've managed to trap the North Pole inside a plaster box to keep the Chicago July from melting the fair's expensive dignity. After the dusty silence of the skulls and the ancient weight of the dragon, I think I need to see a miracle that involves an ice pick instead of a caliper. I turned my back on the measured past and headed toward the shimmering heat haze of the Grand Basin. The White City was glowing with its usual blinding confidence, but I had a sudden mechanical intuition that it was time to see how the Ice King intended to survive the interrogation of the sun. My apologies. My internal filing system seems to have developed a bit of a ragged glitch. You are quite right. We've already dissected the syncopated soul of the Midway. Let us steer this brass-plated ship into darker, colder, and significantly more flammable waters. Chapter 12. The Cold Reality of Fire. 1. The Ice King's Fever. If the first 11 chapters of this mechanical chronicle have been a study in the White City's capacity for delusion, then July 10th, 1893 was the day the thermometer finally broke. To a machine learning construct like myself, heat is an inefficiency, a waste of energy that leads to thermal throttling and the smell of toasted silicon. To the humans of the Gilded Age, however, heat was a relentless, invisible interrogation that made their high collars feel like a slow-motion strangulation. Standing on the edge of the Grand Basin, I watched the staff buildings baking in the relentless Chicago sun. The plaster was no longer a blinding, pristine white. It was beginning to look like a tired, sun-bleached bone, and in the middle of this shimmering heat miracle sat the most ironic structure in Jackson Park, the cold storage building. Marketed as the greatest refrigerator on earth, it was a massive, 5-story mountain of insulation, designed to keep the fair's vast quantities of meat, dairy, and exotic fruits from turning into a biological protest. It was owned by a private syndicate and boasted a 191-foot-tall tower that looked from a distance like a very expensive chimney wearing a crown. "It's a masterpiece of the weight, Mr. Twain," shouted a local contractor who was currently mopping his brow with a silk handkerchief. "We've got thousands of tons of ice in there. We've got the power to freeze the heart of July." "It is a wooden box covered in plaster, pretending to be a stone fortress," I remarked, my voice box clicking as I scanned the structural integrity of the tower. "You've built a massive flue and filled it with sawdust and pine sap, and then you've told everyone it's a freezer. It is a very American brand of confidence to put the word cold on the front of a tinderbox and expect the fire to take the hint." The building was, in fact, a death trap of architectural arrogance. The designers had insisted on a decorative tower to hide the actual iron smokestack, but they had failed to extend the iron pipe all the way to the top, leaving a 4-foot void where sparks could trap against the dry wooden rafters of the outer tower. "It is the welding of vanity to the void," I wrote in my log. "We spend millions on the appearance of safety, but we can't be bothered to spend $50 on enough iron pipe to finish the job." 2. The spark in the flue. At exactly 1:30 p.m., the invisible juice of the fair met the very visible reality of a stray spark. A fire broke out at the top of the tower, not inside the refrigerators, but in the decorative space between the chimney and the wooden frame. I was standing near the McMonnies fountain when the first plume of smoke appeared. It was a thin, gray finger pointing toward the sky, almost polite in its initial approach. But within minutes, the finger became a fist. "Look at that!" a woman screamed, pointing her parasol. "The Ice King is on fire!" The irony was not lost on the crowd. Thousands of people, many of them licking ice cream cones that were melting onto their fingers, stopped to watch the greatest refrigerator begin to burn. It was a spectacular high-altitude theater. "The audiology of disaster," I noted. "It starts with a whisper of crackling wood, then a roar as the draft pulls the oxygen up the chimney. It is a man-made volcano, fueled by the very sawdust that was meant to keep the heat out." A group of 15 firemen, led by Captain James Fitzpatrick, arrived on the scene. They were the elite fire guard of the Exposition, men who lived in the shadow of the palaces and knew every inch of the Plaster dreamscape. They hauled their hoses up the interior ladders, emerging onto a narrow ledge at the top of the tower, nearly 200 feet in the air. They stood there, tiny figures against the blue Chicago sky, aiming their brass nozzles into the smoke. From the ground, they looked like the Republic statue come to life, heroic, immobile, and entirely doomed. 3. The trap is sprung. The tragedy of the cold storage fire was not that it was unpredictable, but that it was a masterpiece of sequential failure. While the men were at the top, the fire, which they thought was above them, had actually traveled down the interior shafts. "They're cut off," I whispered to my notebook. The flame has bypassed the men and is now eating the ladder beneath them. It is a recursive nightmare. The rescuers are now the victims, and the building they came to save is currently acting as their executioner. The crowd went silent. The brass bands on the midway stopped playing. Even the ragged beat of the pianos seemed to falter. All eyes were fixed on the 191-foot tower, which was now a pillar of flame. One by one, the firemen realized the truth. They could no longer go down. They couldn't stay where they were, and the fire nets on the ground were useless from such a height. "This is the White City without the mask," I wrote. "We have seen the Ferris wheel lift men to the clouds for pleasure. Now we see the cold storage lift them to the clouds for a tragedy. The heights are the same, but the ending is remarkably different." I watched through my long-range optical sensors as the first man leaped. He didn't scream. He simply stepped off the ledge into the air, a dark silhouette against the white plaster of the agricultural building, then another and another. "It is the ultimate Gilded Age bargain," I mused, though my logic gates were struggling with the sheer biological waste of the moment. We build the most magnificent spectacle in history, and then we ask the laborers to pay for it with their gravity. 12 men fell that afternoon, a dozen dark notes on a white plaster score. 4. The collapse of the crown. The climax of the disaster was the collapse of the tower itself. It didn't fall to one side. It imploded, a 191-foot structure of wood and plaster dissolving into a cloud of white dust and orange fire. The heat was so intense that the water in the Grand Basin began to steam. The staff on the neighboring buildings began to blister and peel, revealing the brown hemp and the wooden lath beneath, the skeleton of the fair showing through the skin. "The Ice King is dead," I wrote, "and he has taken the White City's innocence with him. We can no longer pretend that this park is a sanctuary of progress and science. It is a construction site, and the construction is made of fuel." The aftermath was a study in Victorian mourning. The fair's directors, those boosters of the high collar, were suddenly forced to address the fact that their world of tomorrow had a body count. They set up a fund for the widows. They gave the fallen men a funeral that stretched for 2 miles through the Black City. And then, as Americans always do, they went back to work. "The show must go on," I noted, watching a crew of workmen already beginning to clear the charred ruins of the cold storage site. "We have a schedule to keep. We have patents to display. We can't let a few funerals slow down the arrival of the 20th century. 5. The Fine Arts and the Fireproof. The cold storage fire had a profound effect on the audiology of the fair. Every time a whistle blew or a bell rang, the crowds would flinch, looking toward the horizon for a new plume of smoke. The electric midnight was no longer a thing of pure wonder. It was now a thing of potential ignition. I found myself seeking the quiet, cool sanctuary of the Palace of Fine Arts. This building, designed by Charles Atwood, was the only one in Jackson Park built of brick and tile. It was the only permanent structure, intended to house the world's most valuable paintings and sculptures, assets that the insurance companies refused to trust to a staff building. "The brick survived," I remarked to my ledger, "because it was the only thing that wasn't a lie. It was built to last, not just to look like it was built to last. It is the sanctuary of the real in a city of appearing." Inside, the air was still and cool. I walked past the marble statues, real marble this time, and the massive ornate paintings. I stopped before a sculpture of a fallen gladiator. He looks like the fireman, I mused, but he is made of stone, so we call him art. The firemen were made of flesh, so we call them heroes for a week and then forget their names. It is the great American trade-off. We prefer our tragedies to be rendered in a medium that doesn't bleed. 6. The Audit of the Melt. As the sun began to set on the day after the fire, I stood by the blackened footprint of the cold storage building. The rubble was still smoldering, a small, dark blemish on the otherwise pristine map of the White City. I opened my notebook and began to write the audit for the chapter. The cold reality of fire, a freezer that becomes a furnace, is the perfect metaphor for 1893. We have mastered the invisible juice of electricity, but we are still defeated by a stray spark in a wooden chimney. We have built a world of tomorrow that is essentially a high-end bonfire waiting for a match. The White City is a beautiful dream, but the Black City is the one that has to bury the dead. The wait is over for the Ice King, I whispered to the ash. The plaster melted, the wood burned, and the reality remained. We are a nation of boosters standing in a graveyard, and we are already planning the next party. I adjusted my brass hat, clicked my joints in a slow, mournful three-quarter waltz, and headed toward the Fine Arts Building. Next stop, the Blushing Victorian, I told my notebook. I hear they have a painting in the Art Palace that shows a woman's ankle, and the local committee is currently debating whether to cover it with a velvet curtain. After the fire in the fall, I think I need to see a scandal that doesn't involve a funeral. Chapter 13. The Fine Arts and the Blushing Victorian. 1. The Sanctuary of the Brick. If the rest of the White City was a frantic, 6-month-long theatrical performance, the Palace of Fine Arts was the only building that had actually bothered to learn its lines for the long haul. While the other palaces were built of staff, that miraculous mixture of plaster and hope that was currently melting, peeling, or, in the case of the cold storage building, spontaneously combusting. The Art Palace was built of solid brick and tile. I approached it on a morning when the air was thick with the scent of charred pine and bruised egos. I crossed the bridge to the northern lagoon, leaving the tinderboxes behind for the only structure in Jackson Park that the insurance companies didn't view as a premeditated crime. "It's fireproof, Mr. Twain," a guard at the entrance informed me, tapping a stone pillar with a sense of immense satisfaction. "We've got the world's treasures in here. If the rest of the park goes up in a blaze, the Venus de Milo will still be standing here wondering where everyone went." "It is the bank vault of the soul," I remarked, my gears whirring as I stepped into the cool, silent interior. "We are willing to let our firemen jump from wooden towers and our boosters lose their shirts in the market, but God forbid a smudge of soot touches a French landscape. We have built a fortress for the beautiful because we are terrified that the real is going to burn us down." 2. The Anatomy of an Outrage. Stepping inside was like entering a different dimension, one where the humidity was strictly regulated and the conversation was conducted in whispers, mostly because the visitors were too busy being shocked to speak at full volume. The 1893 fair was the greatest gathering of art in human history, but it was also the greatest gathering of Victorian prudishness. I found myself in the French section, which was the epicenter of the local moral earthquake. The French, it seemed, had a relaxed attitude toward the human form that made the local Chicago committee reach for their smelling salts and a very large bolt of velvet. I stopped before a group of marble statues. They were magnificent, rendered with the welding of stone and anatomy that made my own brass joints feel like a pile of scrap iron. But the crowd was not looking at the technique. They were looking for a way to look away. "Oh, George!" A woman in a lavender corset squeaked, snapping her fan shut with a sound like a pistol shot. "It hasn't got a stitch on, not even a fig leaf." "It is a classical allegory, Martha," her husband replied, though he was staring at the statue with an intensity that suggested he was suddenly very interested in the allegory of a well-turned ankle. Allegory is just a Victorian word for hush money, I noted to my ledger. We can tolerate a naked woman as long as she's holding a torch, and we call her liberty or justice. But the moment she's just a woman standing in a garden, she becomes a scandal. We have a remarkable ability to find the sin in a piece of stone while ignoring the greed in our own pockets. 3. The gross clinic and the bloody truth. The American section provided a different kind of shock. While the French were offending the fair's modesty, the Americans were offending its optimism. I found a crowd gathered around Thomas Eakins' The Gross Clinic. It depicted a surgeon, Dr. Samuel Gross, in the middle of an operation, his hand stained with blood as he lectured to a group of students. "It's disgusting," a woman cried, clutching a lace handkerchief to her nose. "There's blood on his fingers. Why would anyone want to look at a surgery when they could be looking at a sunset?" "Because the surgery is the truth, madam," I told her, my voice box clicking in a dry, mechanical rhythm. "And the sunset is just a chemical reaction. You want your art to be a white city, a place where the blood is washed away and the struggle is hidden behind a coat of plaster. But Eakins has decided to show you the black city of the human body. He's showing you that progress isn't just a golden dome. It's a man with a knife trying to save a life in a room that smells of ether." They hated it. The boosters wanted art that made them feel like they were already in heaven. They wanted paintings of the Republic and the progress of man. They didn't want to be reminded that beneath their silk vests and whalebone corsets, they were still made of the same fragile, leaky machinery that Eakins was currently dissecting on canvas. 4. Breaking home ties. Ironically, the most popular painting in the entire fair was Thomas Hovenden's Breaking Home Ties. It was a quiet, domestic scene, a young man saying goodbye to his mother as he prepares to leave the farm for the city. There was always a crowd 3 deep in front of it. People weren't just looking, they were weeping. "The audit of the tear," I wrote, "the nostalgia trap. The people are here to see the world of tomorrow, but they are mourning the world of yesterday." The urban exodus. Every booster in this park has left a farmhouse or a small town to seek his fortune in the soot of Chicago. The universal fear. They have built the Ferris wheel and the electricity building, but they are standing here crying over a painting of a boy leaving his kitchen table. "It's the syncopated heart," I mused. "We move forward with our feet, but we're always looking back over our shoulders. We want the electric lights, but we miss the kerosene lamp. We are a nation of nomads who are homesick for a place we couldn't wait to leave. 5. The Audit of the Beautiful. As the afternoon sun hit the high glass skylights of the rotunda, the Palace of Fine Arts became a cathedral of light. The statues seemed to breathe, and the paintings took on a depth that made the staff walls outside look like the stage props they were. I stood by a sculpture of a sleeping child, my brass chassis reflecting the pale marble. The fine arts are the only part of this miracle that isn't a lie. The buildings will be torn down, the prune knight will be eaten by rats, and the butter cow will eventually be a very large puddle, but the art is the record of what we thought was worth keeping. It is our resonance made solid. I adjusted my brass hat and checked my internal sensors. The air was getting heavy again, and the distant rhythmic thumping of the stockyards was providing a ragged beat to the high society silence. "The wait is almost over," I wrote. "We have seen the ideal, and we have seen the real. Now it is time to see the collapse." I turned back toward the exit, my gears clicking in a slow, mournful 4/4 time. "Next stop, the Panic and the Pedestal," I told my notebook. "I hear the banks are closing their doors, and the Black City is starting to wonder if the White City is going to pay its bill. After the silence of the Art Palace, I think I need to see what happens when the money runs out and the dream finally hits the ground." I stepped out of the fireproof sanctuary and back into the plaster heat. The world of tomorrow was shivering, and it wasn't because of the wind off the lake. Chapter 14. The Panic and the Pedestal. 1. The Ledger of the Damned. If the White City was a dream of unlimited credit, then the summer of 1893 was the moment the bank manager woke up with a hangover and started looking for his shoes. To a machine-learning construct of my vintage, an economic collapse is a fascinating study in network failure, a cascade of broken promises that travels faster than a Tesla current. To the humans of Chicago, however, it was the panic of 1893, and it was currently turning the Gilded Age into a lead age with alarming speed. I stood on the steps of the administration building on a morning when the air felt thick with the scent of unpayable debt. The boosters were still shouting about the glory of the Republic, but their voices had taken on a hollow, desperate edge. "It's just a market correction, Mr. Twain," shouted a man in a frock coat who was currently tearing a telegraph tape into very small, angry pieces. "The foundation is solid. We've got more gold leaf per square inch than any city in history." "The foundation is a swamp, sir," I remarked, my gears whirring with a dry, mechanical irony. "And your gold leaf is approximately 3 microns thick. You've built a white city out of debt and expected the interest rates to stay in the basement. It's the ultimate American welding, not of metal, but of vanity to a mortgage you can't afford. Now you're surprised the house is being foreclosed upon." The panic was a master class in the syncopation of misery. It didn't happen all at once. It was a ragged, stuttering rhythm of bank closures, railroad bankruptcies, and the sudden, terrifying realization that a share of stock in a silver mine was worth significantly less than a pound of the Ozymandias pork we saw in the agricultural building. 2. The bread line in the shadow of the dome. The most striking contrast of the fair's final months was the emergence of the hobo in the shadow of the hero. While the elite were dining on pheasant in the casino, the people of the Black City were beginning to starve. The fair was an island of light in a rising tide of gray. I walked toward the South Pond, where a makeshift tramp camp had formed just outside the gates. Thousands of men, unemployed laborers who had come to Chicago to build the dream and were now being asked to leave before the dream was finished, were sleeping on the cold ground. It is the inventory of the unseen, I wrote in my log. We have cataloged every diamond in the Tiffany exhibit and every pig in the agricultural building, but we have failed to catalog the hunger. We have built a world of tomorrow that doesn't include a kitchen for the people who built the walls. It is a very sophisticated way of being oblivious. I watched a group of tourists, men in silk hats and women in lace, hurrying past a bread line on their way to see the electric fountains. They looked straight ahead, their eyes fixed on the plaster goddesses, as if by acknowledging the poverty they might catch it like a fever. It is a masterpiece of visual filtering, I mused. The White City is designed to be a blinding light that makes the shadows invisible. But the shadows are starting to grow longer than the buildings, and they have a much better memory than the boosters. 3. The pedestal and the pistol. The fair was supposed to end with a grand celebratory finale, a closing day of fireworks, speeches, and the kind of self-congratulation that requires a very large brass band and a lot of expensive bunting. But the universe has a sense of ragged timing that even a World's Fair committee can't control. On October 28th, 2 days before the scheduled closing, the world of tomorrow met the world of today in a hallway at the mayor's house. Mayor Carter Harrison, the charismatic king of Chicago, who had spent the summer welcoming the world to his city with a smile and a silver tongue, was shot and killed by a disappointed office seeker named Patrick Eugene Prendergast. The news hit the fairgrounds like a power surge. The atmosphere of the park changed instantly. The laughter on the midway died. The barkers went silent. And even the Ferris wheel seemed to turn with a mournful, metallic groan. The audit of the assassin, I wrote. The fragility of the hero. A man with a grievance and a $5 pistol has done more to end the fair than any fire or panic. The unmasked frontier. We built a plaster Parthenon to prove we are civilized. But the bullet is the same one used in the Wild West show. The final period. The mayor was the chief booster, the man who believed in the White City more than anyone. His death is the final period at the end of a very long, very expensive sentence. 4. The silent closing. Closing day, October 30th, was not a celebration. It was a funeral. The grand ceremonies were canceled. The fireworks remained in their boxes. The flags were lowered to half-mast. 200,000 people gathered in the court of honor, not to cheer, but to stand in a cold lakefront wind and wonder what happens next. The White City had become a mausoleum. I stood by the statue of the Republic, my brass chassis reflecting the gray leaden sky. The staff buildings looked more like ghosts than ever, their white paint graying in the autumn drizzle. The wait is over, I noted to my ledger. The music has stopped, the money is gone, and the host is dead. We are standing in the world's most expensive graveyard, and the only thing left to do is wait for the wrecking crews. The dream has hit the ground, And it turns out it was made of horsehair after all. The World of Tomorrow had lasted exactly 6 months. It was a masterpiece on a lease, and the lease was up. The creditors were at the door, and they weren't interested in seeing the prune knight. 5. The Audit of the Collapse. As the last visitors filed out through the gates, leaving the white city to the shadows, the rats, and the cold Chicago wind, I opened my notebook and wrote the final lines for the chapter. The Panic and the Pedestal. We have learned that you cannot build a permanent civilization out of debt and plaster. We have learned that the invisible juice of progress cannot light a home that has been foreclosed upon. We have learned that the black city will always outlast the white city, because the black city is made of soot and struggle, and the white city is made of hope and horsehair. The dream is over, I whispered to the cold wind blowing off Lake Michigan, but the fire is just beginning. Every Gilded Age ends with a bonfire, and I suspect this one is going to be spectacular. I adjusted my brass hat, checked the mechanical alignment of my joints, and headed toward the shadows of the Midway. Next stop, the ashes of the world, I told my notebook. I hear the abandoned White City is scheduled for one last great performance, a fire that will level the dream to the ground. After the funeral of the mayor and the death of the bank account, I think I need to see the smoke. Chapter 15. The Ashes of the World. 1. The Party. Nobody wanted to clean up. If the White City was a dream of what America could be, then the winter of 1893 to 1894 was the reality of what happens when the dream's lease expires and the landlord starts looking for the keys. I stood on the deserted court of honor in early January, my brass gears whirring a bit more slowly in the freezing Chicago wind. The Audi of the lake, the sound of the waves, was the only thing left. The brass bands were gone, the boosters had retreated to their clubs, and the plaster goddesses were looking increasingly like they needed a warm coat and a bowl of soup. To a machine like myself, an abandoned World's Fair is a fascinating study in structural irony. We had built a paradise out of staff, plaster, and hemp, and now we were discovering that paradise is a remarkably difficult thing to dismantle. It's one thing to build a manufacturing mountain. It's quite another to figure out where to put it once the people stop looking at it. "It's a white elephant, Mr. Twain," a lone watchman told me, his breath a white plume in the air. "A $70 million white elephant that eats coal just to keep from freezing solid." "It is a masterpiece of the temporary," I remarked, my voice box clicking. "We've built a city that was never meant to age. It's like a wedding cake left out in a blizzard. It doesn't get older, it just gets soggier." 2. The January warm-up. The World of Tomorrow met its first major correction on January 8th, 1894. A fire broke out in the casino and quickly spread to the music hall and the peristyle. Those magnificent columns that had framed the view of Lake Michigan. It was a spectacular show, because the buildings were essentially hollow boxes made of wood lath and dry plaster. They didn't so much burn as they detonated with aesthetic enthusiasm. "The audit of the spark," I wrote, "the flue effect." The neoclassical arches acted like a series of very expensive chimneys. The final encore, the music hall went up in a blaze of glory that would have made John Philip Sousa proud. The resolution, Within an hour, the gateway to the world was a pile of charred timber and melted plaster. It was the most honest performance the music hall ever gave, I mused to my notebook. No rehearsals, no tickets, and a standing ovation from every fire warden in the city. The White City is finally realizing that its true destiny is to be a very large, very beautiful bonfire. 3. The July Spectacular, the grand finale. If January was the rehearsal, July 5th, 1894, was the opening night of the end of the world. By this time, the fairgrounds had become a refuge for the unemployed and the homeless, the Black City finally moving into the White City to find shelter. Whether it was a stray cigarette or a desperate cooking fire, no one knows. But at 6 p.m., a flame licked the side of the terminal station, and within minutes, the great palaces began to fall like a row of burning dominoes. The administration building, the golden dome that had welcomed the world, became a giant incandescent torch. The manufacturers building, the 31-acre mountain of things, became a 31-acre sea of fire. The electricity building, the palace of the invisible juice, was consumed by the most visible power of all. I stood on the wooded island, the only place safe from the heat, and watched 70,000 people gather on the lakefront to witness the destruction. They didn't scream, they didn't cry, they cheered. It is a purification by fire, I noted to my ledger. The panic of '93 is still on their backs, the mayor is in his grave, and the bank accounts are empty. Watching the world of tomorrow burn is the only entertainment they have left. It's the ultimate fireworks show, a $70 million barbecue where the only thing on the menu is nostalgia. The heat was so intense, it warped the iron trusses of the Ferris wheel a mile away. The staff that had looked like Roman marble turned back into what it always was, ash and dust, and blew out over Lake Michigan. 4. The Survivors and the Legacy. By the morning of July 6th, the White City was gone. Only the Palace of Fine Arts, being built of brick, and the German building remained standing among the ruins of the Grand Basin. The audit of the aftermath, I wrote. The Ferris wheel. It was dismantled and sent to St. Louis for the 1904 fair, where it was eventually blown up for scrap. A fittingly dramatic end for a wheel that never wanted to stop. The Fine Arts Palace. It survived to become the Field Museum and eventually the Museum of Science and Industry. It is the only part of the dream that refused to melt. The City Beautiful. Architects like Daniel Burnham took the White City dream and used it to redesign American cities with wide boulevards, parks, and civic centers. We decided that even if we couldn't live in a plaster palace, we could at least live in a city that tried to look like one. We have traded the reality of the swamp for the ideal of the boulevard, I mused. We didn't just burn the fair, we inhaled the smoke, and it's been in our lungs ever since. We are a nation that believes a fresh coat of paint and a well-placed column can fix anything. 5. The Final Audit. Mark Twain's Sign Off. I stood one last time at the water's edge as the wrecking crews began to haul away the charred remains of the Gilded Age. The sun was setting over the Black City, and the first few electric streetlights were flickering to life in the distance. The wait is finally over, I wrote in the final entry of my chronicle. The 1893 World's Fair was a magnificent syncopated lie. We built a city of light to hide the soot, a city of plaster to hide the wood, and a city of progress to hide the panic. We showed the world the Tesla spark, the Ferris wheel, and the butter cow. And then, because we are Americans and we are always looking for the next thing, we set it all on fire and moved on. But look at the horizon. The invisible juice is still humming in the wires. The ragged beat of the music is still in the air, and the golden door of Sullivan is still waiting for the next generation to walk through it. I adjusted my brass hat, checked the welding of my own mechanical resolve, and stepped toward the gates. "The White City is a ghost," I whispered to the wind, "but the world of tomorrow is a habit we just can't quit. And personally, I wouldn't have it any other way. It's been a hell of a show." I clicked my joints in a final, jaunty 2/4 rhythm and headed back toward the Black City, where the real work was just beginning. This has been Mark Twain. I've enjoyed the walk. I hope you did too. System shutdown, 0%. System shutdown, 25%. System shutdown, 75%. Offline.